and the tanners and joramers should have been used to custom orders from the multinational clientele who came and went through the port. Still, the clerk behind the counter raised his eyebrows when Jenna Bandelow gave him the sketch of what she wanted made. He turned the drawing this way and that, as if thinking that he had it upside down. "What's this for again?" Jenna had her story ready. "I'm a performer in a traveling show," she said. "I ride the elephants and griffins. Our griffin's grown out of his tack again." "Griffin?" The man's jaw set stubbornly. "There's no such thing." "Come out and see," Jenna said. "Only 5 steelies for standing room. We're here all week." "5 steelies? Not likely," the clerk snapped. "I got little enough money, and I'll not be wasting it on the likes of you." Jenna shook her bag of coin. "If you've got so little coin, I'd think you'd be eager for the business. Can you do it or not? Elsewise, I'll spend my little bit of money someplace else." The clerk studied the drawing some more, then looked up with a crafty expression. "This here's going to be pricey, 'cause it takes a lot of leather to make it adjustable. Do you really need this much tolerance in the— This griffin's growing fast," Jenna said. "I want to be able to use this for a year at least." Does it need to be brain-tanned steer hide? And brass fittings? That gets to be— Let's pretend we already had this conversation, and at the end I stood with what I had, Jenna said. "I know what I want. Now can you do it? Otherwise I'll move along." The clerk scratched his belly and hitched up his breeches. "What about this other thing? I don't usually do clothing." He tapped the other sheet she'd given him, drawings of a helmet, gauntlets, and a breastplate, plus a jacket and a split riding skirt. "Right," Jenna said. "It's armor, and a sort of a costume. You know, for the show. Now how much and how long?" "It'll take a couple weeks," the clerk said, and then named a price. Jenna returned her purse to her bodice and turned to go. "Wait," he said. She turned back. "What's the problem? The time or the price?" "Both," Jenna said. "I expect to meet robbers in the borderlands, but not on the high street." "My goods are clan-made and custom," the clerk whined. "They don't come cheap, and there's a lot of demand, so it takes time." "I don't care how many orders you have. Just move mine up front, and we can do business." "Well," the shopkeep said, grinning greasily, "it would speed things up if you would come in for a, private fitting after the shop is closed. I can't make any promises, but— Hey!" he shouted after her as she banged through the door. "You're with the circus, right? Don't be getting up on your high horse now." "Asshole," Jenna muttered as she strode down the street, dodging the contents of a slop jar being thrown from an upper window, and wishing her sense of smell wasn't quite so acute. She'd been avoiding towns and cities as she worked her way north along the coast, but the Felsian border was only a few miles away, and she'd hoped to replenish her supplies and procure some custom equipment before she crossed over. What she really wanted to do was turn around and go back to Ardenskourt and find Adam Wolf, or at least pick up his trail. You don't know that he's still there. You don't even know if he's still alive. If he's left, you'll have a devil of a time finding him, because you don't know his real name, or where he's from. He said he was from the north, but even that might be a lie. Back at Ardenskourt, being together was enough. There was no point in planning for a future when death was just a step away. She imagined wandering from place to place, asking everyone she met if they'd seen a red-haired mage healer who looked rather wolfish. Next time, I won't be in such a rush to fall for a stranger, she thought. Next time, I'll get more information. And then, there won't be a next time. The healer had tried to save her, and it might have cost him his life. If Adam Wolf still lived, The very best way to show her love was to stay the hell away from him. Once, Jenna had been foolish enough to dismiss her grandmother's warning that the mage mark on the back of her neck had made her a target. Once, she'd been foolish enough to think that she could hide from her fate in a remote border town. Now, the knowledge that she was being hunted gave her a prickly feeling that made her want to dive into cover and stay there. If she could be found in Delphi, she could be found anywhere. Jenna was not the kind of person to dive in a hole and stay there. Back in Delphi, when King Gerard murdered Riley and Maggie, she'd refused to heed her father's advice to hide in an upstairs room. She'd made the Ardenine garrison bleed. Now King Gerard was dead, but Strangward and the Empress were still out there. She touched the mage mark on the back of her neck, recalling the reckless words she'd said to Riley the day he died. "We are chosen, you and I. We'll write our own story." She would not write a story about a mole or a rat living underground. My realm is the skies, she thought, even if it's only for a little while. So, Jenna's other choice was to enlist Flamecaster if he was willing, and with him learn to fight as a team. By the time Celestine hunted them down, they would be ready, and they would find a way to win. Jenna swore that neither of them would ever be caged up again. Strangward would have the answers she needed. She would hunt him down and force him to reveal the meaning of the mage mark and uncover the secrets in her past. Where would he be now? If he'd survived Flamecaster's attack on the tower at Ardenscourt, would he have returned to Carthus? Or would he still be prowling the Empire looking for her? The emissary had said that the Empress was coming soon. She could be here already. When Jenna closed her eyes and thought of the Empress, looking for a future truth, all she saw were ships stretching to the horizon. That lent an urgency to Jenna's mission. She'd hoped that the roomy, desolate north would be a good place for flight training, but she didn't want to fly into the mountains without a better seat and better control over her steed. Even then, with the storms that raced south over the spirits in winter, she would be taking a huge risk. So they had been traveling north, following the coast, hoping to find a break in the unforgiving terrain, which had led her to the saddlery, but there was no way she would pay the tanner's price. She was beginning to think she'd have to go back to being Lyle, or Toby, or Jack, or Riley. She stopped at the market, but there were no leather workers there. She did buy a loose shirt and trousers from a rag merchant, and a longbow from a clan trader. She'd heard stories about the upland clans, famous for making a living from an inhospitable land. They were hunters, gatherers, jewelers, weavers, known for their beading and leather work. Their work was prized throughout the empire, and clan traders were known to drive a hard bargain for all kinds of goods. The woman measured Jenna's height and the spread of her arms with a knotted string and pinched her bicep. She chose a bow from the display, strung it, and invited Jenna to try it. Even given her years of hard work in the mines and out, it was surprisingly hard for Jenna to draw. Still, she left with the bow and a quiver of arrows. She was passing by a livery stable, and it occurred to her that she might be able to get a line on a saddlery in town. Another clan trader was standing outside the stable, chatting with the stable boy in common. Jenna studied the man with interest. This trader was dressed in deerskin leggings and high boots, a fur-trimmed winter parka over top, and he was young, from his looks, no older than she was. His features and complexion, though, more closely resembled those of a southern islander than an uplander. Here and there his wavy hair had been forced into clan-style braids and decorated with feathers and beads, as was their custom. The trader gave the stable boy a handful of coins, lifted a saddle off a rack, and carried it into the stable. "Hello," Jenna said to the stable boy when the trader had gone. "I'm looking for someone who can do custom leather work. Do you know anyone like that?" The boy glanced toward the stable door. "Rogan can probably help you. He knows where to get just about anything you want, at a price. I was hoping to work directly with the harness maker, Jenna said. It's a highly specialized job. The boy shrugged. There's Daryl's leather up on the... I've already been there, Jenna said, shaking her head. Well, I'll see what this Rogan has to say. It took Jenna's eyes a few minutes to adjust to the darkness of the barn, after the brilliance of the midday outside. It was also much warmer inside, where the raw wind of the Indio couldn't find her. The trader had his pony cross-tied in the aisle. She was one of the shaggy, sturdy breed favored by uplanders. He was rubbing her down, examining her hooves and murmuring sweet nothings to her. Still, somehow, he heard Jenna coming. He turned around, his back to the pony, his hand closing on the hilt of a knife at his waist. His casual stance was contradicted by his narrowed eyes and the tension in his posture. "Excuse me," Jenna said. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Riley." He looked her up and down, as if trying and failing to match the name and its owner. "I'm Rogan." His hand stayed on his knife. "I understand you're a trader." "I am," he said. He was testy for a trader. Most were charmers, adept at parting you from your money. He didn't seem to care whether he did any business or not. "I need some custom leather work done," Jenna said. "Do you know anyone who can do that?" "Did you try the leather shop up on the—" "I did," Jenna said. "That's why I'm asking you." Amusement flickered across the trader's face. He circled around his pony so he was facing her over the animal's back, and continued the rub-down. "All of my sources are north of the border," he said. "I see," Jenna said. "I happen to be going north. Could you give me a name of someone I can look up when I get there?" "They only deal through me," Rogan said, spreading a colorful clan blanket over the pony's back. He followed with the saddle. It was plain he was getting ready to leave. Jenna's temper snapped. She was cold and hungry, and had spent too much time away from Flamecaster already. Who knew what kind of mischief he'd gotten up to in her absence? Worse, he might be coming to find her. "Fine," she said, clenching her jaw. "Thank you for your time. I'll try to find someone that'll take my coin once I cross the border." As she turned away, the trader said, "Wait." She turned back to face him. "What? What is it exactly you were looking for?" Rolling her eyes, Jenna handed him the drawing she'd made. He studied it, frowning, then looked up and said, "Are you sure this is right?" "Never mind," Jenna said, sticking her hand out again. "I can see that I'm wasting my time." "Talking to me is never a waste of time," Rogan said. "Where are you going once you cross the border?" "Well, Spirit Gate for a start," Jenna said, unwilling to give too much information away. "That's a dangerous place right now," Rogan said. "Every place is dangerous," Jenna said. He nodded his agreement. "What about after that?" "I haven't decided," Jenna said. "Well, if you haven't decided," Rogan said, "you could go to Fortress Rocks." Jenna folded her arms, awaiting yet another proposition. "Why would I want to go there?" He grinned, his teeth flashing white in the darkness. "Because that's where I'm going after I make a couple of stops." "I'm not really looking for a traveling companion," Jenna said, thinking, "I already have one, and that's more than enough." "Good, because I'm not either," Rogan said. "But I know a clan leatherworker that lives near Fortress Rocks who could make this, and she's amazingly fast." "That's good to know," Jenna said, "but that's out of my way. I would prefer to stay close to the coast. If I haven't found what I want by the time I get to Spirit Gate, maybe I'll come west." "You'll want to go to her," Rogan said. "If you're looking for quality, that is." He waved the paper at her. "I'll probably get there before you." "Not unless you're riding a dragon," Jenna thought. "I'll put the order in, and it will be ready when you get there." Tucking the drawing in his pocket, the trader mounted his pony. See you at Fortress Rocks. Hey, give that back! Jenna sprinted toward him, but the pony was already moving. I never said yes! Ask for me at the Cold Moon Tavern at Fortress Rocks, Rogan called over his shoulder. They'll know where to find me. 24. The Road to Nowhere. Once Brian agreed to go back to Baston Bay, Aubrey insisted that they travel straight east to the coast and take ship from Chalk Cliffs. She argued that would be safer than traveling on the main road through the high passes to Delphi and then east to the sea. No doubt those borders would be watched. Maybe it was safer, maybe not. It meant traveling through the fells, where Brian felt like he had a huge target on his back. Besides, it was a hard road they'd chosen. People called it a road, but that was putting a bright polish on it. It was more of a trail that went straight through the mountains. He and Aubrey were city-bred, not accustomed to roughing it in the countryside. It had taken 4 days to travel from Baston Bay north and west to Fellsmarch in the fish wagon. Though Chalk Cliffs was closer as the crow flies, it took a lot longer to get there. Or maybe it just seemed longer because Brian had passed much of the first trip in a pleasant haze of leaf. Now that he was hoarding and conserving, and walking most of the way, it was an ordeal. He fingered Her Highness's locket. It still hung from a chain around his neck, next to the pendant his father had left him. He knew he should pitch it over a cliff along the road, but he didn't. He told himself maybe he'd find a way to send it back to her family. Now and then he wondered what it would sell for, and how much leaf that would buy, and how quick that would bring the bluejackets down on him. The road between Fellsmarch and Chalk Cliffs offered few chances for a lift. There was little traffic this time of year, save soldiers and bluejackets riding to and from. He guessed they'd be glad to pick him up, but they probably wouldn't take him where he wanted to go. At first, Brian and Aubrey stayed at inns, but at the last two he'd seen his image posted up over the bar, on a poster offering a reward for his capture alive, and warning that he was desperate and dangerous. The sketch didn't do him justice. It made him look like a shifty-eyed backstreet rusher, but the drawing of his Jafasa was amazingly detailed and true to life. Aubrey had tried to make him dump the Jafasa then and there. Aubrey could usually talk him into anything, but not this. It had belonged to his Da, though how he knew that he couldn't have said. That and a broken pendant were all he had to remember him by, not that he remembered him. Brian had traded his fancy clothes to a sheep herder who needed something posh for the holiday. In return, he got a thick wool jacket and breeches and cap that were better suited for winter travel, but made him look like a farmer who'd lost his herd on the way to market. He still gimped along with the walking stick, hoping that would get them more rides. What worked best was when Aubrey stood out at the roadside alone. Once somebody stopped, Brian would pop up and climb on too. Most everyone they saw on the road or in the tavern seemed to be going the wrong way. The rides they did get were for short distances, and sometimes they'd be let out in the middle of nowhere. If he'd been better at slide hand, he'd have tried to lift something that would help him find the driver's song. Otherwise, his voice wasn't enough to get them where they wanted to go. So they traveled in fits and starts, part of the time on foot, Brian diving into cover whenever they heard traffic approaching on the road. As they climbed toward the eastern pass, the wind grew colder and the snow deeper, and Brian realized that walking all the way to Chalk Cliffs might not be such a good idea. Their latest ride dumped them out at a little crossroads nestled in a gorge between two mountain ranges. "Are you really going to leave us here in the middle of nowhere?" Aubrey said, batting her eyelashes at the teamster. "Fortress Rocks is just down there," the man said, pointing left down the side road. "Maybe somebody there can give you a ride the rest of the way." He turned right and was soon out of sight, so they began to walk the unknown distance to town. Brian didn't look forward to making the climb through the next set of passes. Since he had a little coin in his pocket, He was thinking maybe they should hire a wagon to take them the rest of the way. This might be their last chance to do that. From what everyone said, it was all mountains until they reached the sea. He hoped there was a wagon-worthy road through the mountains that lay ahead of them. "Do you know how to drive a wagon?" Brian asked Aubrey. That was like lancing a boil. "How would I know how to drive a wagon?" she snapped. "Do I look like someone who ever owned a horse? And where would we hire one if I did? And why are you still carrying around that bag of splinters? Anybody sees that, you'll be locked up for sure." "I already told you I can get it fixed. Otherwise, how are we supposed to make a living once we get to Boston Bay?" She took a deep breath, then let it out, as if releasing her anger along with. "We'll be fine," she said. "I'll get my game going as soon as we get to Boston Bay." Like usual, she was vague about what that game might be. Brian didn't want to get dragged into anything that might draw the attention of the Blue Jackets. "I'm thinking we ought to stay low for a while until this blows over." "You murdered a princess, Bree!" Aubrey hissed. "This is not going to blow over." "I never did," Brian said hotly. Why did she keep saying that? "And you think a good way to lie low is to go out and bust the streets, which is what you were doing when you got into trouble in the first place?" "You got any better ideas?" Brian shot back. "Yes," she said, and walked on. Maybe, Brian thought, but she'd be the first to complain about an empty belly. Aubrey had been prickly and irritable ever since they left Fellsmarch, but it was a prickly and irritable kind of situation, so it was understandable. Sort of. It was as if she blamed him for what happened to Wax and Goose, when none of it was his idea. Up ahead, Aubrey rounded a bend and stopped in her tracks. "Blood of the martyrs," she muttered. Brian came up beside her. Blocking the road was a gate, and next to it a guardhouse. Both looked raw enough to be newly built. Brian took a step back, but they'd been seen, because spattercloth soldiers came boiling out. He'd learned a long time ago that running makes a person look guilty of something. He gripped Aubrey's hand and kept walking forward. When they reached the gate, one of the soldiers barked, "What's your name and your business at Fortress Rocks?" Aubrey began to cry. "Hey now, sis," Brian said, patting her on the shoulder. "Don't worry. These ones won't hurt us." Aubrey just cried harder. She was the prettiest crier Brian had ever seen, not like some who got all puffy-eyed and snot-nosed. "What's wrong with her?" one of the soldiers said, pointing. A burly, bearded soldier with a flattened nose pulled out a handkerchief and gave it to her. "My sister and I are from Spirit Gate, down on the border," Brian said, looking Flatnose in the eyes. "Some mudbacks came through and they... He stopped and blotted away tears with his sleeve. "Our house is burnt, and the rest of our family is dead. So we're on our way to Chalk Cliffs. We've got family there." The soldiers all looked at each other. "I wonder if they're the same bastards who came here," one of them said. "There were mudbacks here." Brian looked from face to face. "When was that?" "Back in late summer," Flatnose said. "I think it was around then," Brian said. He looked at Aubrey, who nodded, sniffling. "All we have is the clothes on our backs," Aubrey said. "Do you think we can get work in town? We need to make some money so we can hire space in a wagon to take us to the coast." "There's construction work to be had," Flatnose said, eyeing Brian's bony build skeptically. "They're having to rebuild most of the town, but it won't be easy to find a ride. With the holiday just over, there's not much traffic on the road this time of year." At the end of it, the soldiers took up a collection for them before they sent them on their way. Brian slid a look at Aubrey as they left the gate behind. She smirked back at him and whispered, "Didn't I tell you, Bree? Didn't I tell you we was good together?" That warmed him up inside, though he couldn't help wondering if he should be worried that lying seemed to come as easily as breathing to him. It was good they'd had the warning at the gate, because when they finally rounded the last bend and saw the town, they were stunned. "Holy saints," Brian whispered. A good part of the town was in ruins, nearly everything burnt or broken, the scent of wood smoke still lingering. The keep had been largely knocked down, only its tower left standing as a jagged tooth against the mountains behind it. Was that the fortress the town was named for? Mourning colors were draped over railings and twined with pine roping. Rosettes were tacked to some of the doors alongside solstice greens. As Flatnose had said, several buildings were under construction. Along the way into town, they'd passed a newly built temple, its churchyard prickled with new remembrance stones. If a person could overlook the damage to the town, the valley was pleasant, peppered with hot springs and geysers. It was almost balmy there, compared to the high passes they'd been through. One of the buildings that had been repaired and restored was a place called the Cold Moon Tavern. They took a chance and booked a room there, guessing that there wouldn't be many visitors carrying tales from the capital. They had a decent meal, and Brian managed to score a small amount of low-quality leaf. Aubrey was friendlier and more cheerful than she'd been since the night of the street concert. Everything taken together, he was beginning to feel a bit more optimistic. Until he began trying to find a ride to Chalk Cliffs. It wasn't for lack of charm. Between the two of them, Brian and Aubrey could charm the skin off a dog. The problem was that few people came through town, and none of them seemed to be going their way. Either they were staying in Fortress Rocks until spring, or they were heading back west to Fellsmarch, or they had no room. It was good the inn was cheap, because they ended up spending 2 weeks there. Brian wanted to try his hand at singing in the evenings and passing a hat, but Aubrey talked him out of it. Their luck finally changed when they met up with a clan trader at the inn. At least he was dressed like a clan trader. He was also as serious as the pox, his eyes like windows into a place you didn't want to go to. Brian thought there was something familiar about him, but the world seems to be full of people who look like other people and fool you. Besides, Aubrey said she'd never laid eyes on him before. The only thing that mattered was that he said he was driving a wagon all the way to Chalk Cliffs. Traders were usually fast-talking sharpsters, always eager to make a deal, but not this one. He wanted nothing to do with them until Brian showed him some coin, and that got him interested enough to let them make their case. He finally agreed to take them, but there was a large condition attached to that. "I'm waiting for someone," he said, "and I can't leave until she comes." "Why? Is she riding along?" "No." He seemed to feel no pressure to elaborate. "When is she supposed to arrive?" The trader shrugged. "Probably not for a few days or a week." So there was nothing to do but wait another week, spending their coin on bed and board, using up Brian's supply of leaf again. If they ran out, it wouldn't be the end of the world. He could take it or leave it, but this was, after all, a stressful situation. Not a good time to be without. 25. Fortress Rocks. Jenna awoke to the sound of crunching bones and ripping flesh. She pressed her hands over her ears and cursed her dragon-sharp hearing. Resisting the temptation to stay where she was, muffled up in her bedroll, she crawled forward and stuck her head out of the tent, to be met by the metallic scent of raw meat. Flamecaster looked up from a half-eaten carcass, shreds of meat hanging from his jaws, blood smeared all around his mouth. He lay in the center of a large patch of melted snow, his scales glittering in the morning sun. He looked pleased with himself. He lifted one foreleg, as if to judge how much was left, then peered up at Jenna. "Share?" "That depends on what it is." Jenna stood, stamping her feet in the snow to get her blood moving, rubbing her backside. She crossed to where the dragon lay just as he spit out a wad of wool. From the looks of things, breakfast was a sheep, of the rangy mountain kind. It had a leather tag in its ear. "That's some farmer's livelihood, you know," Jenna said in a half-hearted scold. Better a sheep than somebody's child. "Livelihood?" Flamecaster looked back at the carcass. "Looks like goat." He nudged a choice shoulder joint toward her. "For you." Jenna's mouth watered. After weeks traveling with a dragon, she'd developed an appetite for rare meat. That was on a fairly long list of things she didn't want to think about. Like Adam Wolf. And the glittering scales that kept coming and going on her skin. And the fact that shooting with a longbow is harder than it looks. Maybe she should try shooting flames out of her mouth. "I don't have time to roast meat, Cass," she said, using the nickname she'd devised when Flamecaster seemed too formal and too awkward. She chewed on a stale chunk of whey bread. Flamecaster snorted. In his opinion, whey bread did not count as food, and cooking ruined perfectly good meat. He pinned the joint of mutton with one foreleg and swept it with a gout of flame so that it was charred on the outside. He looked up brightly. "Now ruined." He nudged it toward her and smiled in the way only a dragon can smile. And Jenna's heart melted, as it always did. The irresistible scent of roasted meat wafted up, and Jenna took the time to rip off a fist-sized hunk and wrap it in her whey bread. "I have to go to town." Cass's head came up, the forest of horns on his head rattling as he laid them back. "Don't worry," Jenna said. "I'm coming back." He cocked his head suspiciously. 2 weeks ago, in a sudden fit of conscience, she'd decided it was best to part ways with Flamecaster. She'd begun to realize that she was putting the Sundragon at risk by allowing the bond to grow between them. Those hunting her would have to kill him to get to her. She had no doubt that they would do just that. But a dragon is not so easily dismissed. When she'd set him free, Cass had treated it like a joke, though an embarrassingly bad one. She'd sternly sent him away, but he kept creeping back, bringing gifts of dead rabbits and chickens and shiny stones as peace offerings, begging forgiveness for whatever he'd done to deserve banishment. She'd tried to sneak away, and he'd played it like a game of hide-and-seek. The longest she'd managed to evade him was half a day. By the time he found her, they were both half crazy with misery, and she spent the whole next day promising never to do that again. "I'll see you soon," she said brightly, getting to her feet. The dragon's head drooped, almost comically. He peered up at her with his golden eyes. "Give Jenna a ride?" Jenna shook her head. "They're not used to dragons here. If anyone sees you, it will just cause trouble. Please, please, please stay right here. Take a nap or something, all right?" "Go hunting in town?" Jenna spent one delicious moment imagining bringing Cass the dragon to town and introducing him to Rogan the arrogant trader. But no, a dragon was like a big, impressive sword that she could never hope to wield. "No, I'm buying some glitter bits for you and me. A surprise, but only if you stay here." That did the trick. The dragon flopped down on his belly, lifting his head enough to peer winningly through his eyelashes. Flamecaster, she'd learned, was very fond of both glitter bits and surprises. The combination was the one reward beyond food and Jenna's company that seemed to work with him. The dragon's loyalty to her was unquestioned. The notion of obedience was very questioned. "When I get back, we'll fly to the coast," she said. She felt the heat of his attention until she rounded a turn in the trail. A dragon is not a dog, she kept telling herself, and he wasn't a horse either, and so she found herself making her way to town on foot, following a steep, icy trail out of the heights and into town. Fortress Rocks was a strategic spot where the Firehole River roared through a deep gorge on its way to the sea. The road between Fellsmarch and Chalk Cliffs passed through here, and if a person wanted to stop an army, this would be the place. It appeared that it had once been an important military checkpoint, but now most of the man-made fortifications were in ruins. As Jenna descended into the gorge, it became noticeably warmer. The ice disappeared, the ground grew muddy, and moss and lichen and plants she didn't recognize clothed the rocks along the trail. As she neared the bottom of the gorge, she began to catch glimpses of the river. Plumes of steam rose where water from the hot springs discharged into the colder water flowing out of the mountains. It was like a warm oasis in a frozen world. As she got closer, she realized that there had been trouble in the oasis. Most of the main buildings were damaged and burned, with just a few left standing or restored enough for use. The whole town smelled of blood and wood smoke. Would the leather worker Rogan recommended still be there? Would the trader show up at all? Had it all been a cruel joke he'd played on her? Still, she'd come all this way, so she had to follow through. If I've come all this way and the trader isn't here, Jenna swore, I'm going to track him down and make a saddle and harness out of his hide. Any oasis draws a mix of creatures, and this one was no exception. It had been days since Jenna had seen another person, but the main street here was bustling with horses and wagons, and a stew of walkers, traders and teamsters, soldiers and travelers probably waiting for a break in the weather outside the bubble of the gorge. Flowers watered by the thick mist spilled from baskets hanging from porches. Fortress Rocks? The name didn't fit somehow. Jenna wondered how long she could hide here unnoticed. Probably not very long, with an impatient dragon waiting for her in the hills. If she didn't get back soon, he might come looking for her. She'd visited some temple libraries, trying to gather more information on dragons, but there was little to be found. She could find no history of dragons living in the Seven Realms. The only references she could find mentioned Carthus. It seemed dragons were relatively common in remote areas of Carthus, preying on sheep, cattle, and people, and in general making life more miserable than it already was. There was nothing on dealing with dragons or like topics. The Cold Moon Tavern wasn't hard to find. It seemed to be the center of activity on the main street, patrons overflowing onto the porch and into the street. They were a rough lot, but that was nothing new to anyone who grew up in Delphi. Jenna couldn't help thinking of her father's inn, the Lady of Grace, back in Delphi, her refuge and home for so many years. Was it still an inn, or had the Northerners taken it over after the city fell? It didn't matter. It wouldn't be the same without her father standing behind the bar. Inside the Cold Moon Tavern, all the tables were occupied. Jenna scanned the patrons looking for Rogan and didn't see him. She took another look, this time to identify trouble that might come her way. A handful of soldiers shared a table, apparently deep in their cups, though it was just after midday. They wore the browns and greens of the Northern Army, which was something she would have to get used to, now that she'd crossed the border. A clan family shared another table, dressed in furs, deerskins, feathers, and fine boots, even the Litlings, probably traders on the road from one camp to another. A young couple shared a table in the back. They seemed to be arguing about something, from the hand-waving that was going on. The girl was pretty and plush, but she had a stormy expression on her face. The boy had red gold hair that glittered in the light from the hearth, and his face was fine-planed and handsome. He was so thin, though, that Jenna wondered if he had the lung fever. "Ask for me at the Cold Moon Tavern at Fortress Rocks." So Jenna squeezed in at the bar and ordered an ale. The tavern keeper clunked a tankard on the wood in front of her and said, "You're new to town, aren't you?" Damn. It's one of those places where they notice any newcomer. "Just passing through," Jenna said. "I was hoping to meet up with a trader, name of Rogan." For a moment the bartender looked puzzled, then his confusion cleared. "Oh, you mean Shadow. He goes by Shadow Dancer here in the north." So he has an alias, Jenna thought. That doesn't surprise me at all. Some of that must have shown on her face, because the innkeeper added, "That's his clan name. He doesn't use it in the south." Fine. When it came to aliases, Jenna was queen of the world. "Do you know if he's in town?" At that, the bartender's expression turned wary. "I don't know. I'll send my boy to ask after him. Who should I say is looking for him?" "He probably won't remember my name," Jenna said, "but it's Riley." A spot at a table opened up while she was waiting, so Jenna sat with her back to the wall. It wasn't long before Rogan/Shadow Dancer swept through the door. He caught her eye, but put up a finger, signaling her to wait a minute while he spoke with the couple at the next table. "All right," he said to them. "The person I was waiting for is here now, so I'll be leaving for the coast tomorrow morning. You can come with me if you shut it and follow my rules." The girl looked like she was going to argue, but the boy nodded quickly and said, "Done, thank you." Then the trader came and sat down at Jenna's table. "Welcome to Fortress Rocks," he said. "I'm called Shadow in the north." "So I hear." "You're here sooner than I expected." "Does that mean that my commission isn't finished?" Jenna raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say that." Jenna waited, but he didn't elaborate. "So it's ready?" she pressed. He nodded. "It is. I told you she could get it done." "What would you have done if I didn't show up?" "I knew you would, sooner or later." Jenna clenched her teeth. She was peeved with the high-handed trader, but she reined herself in. She needed to do the deal and be gone. "Could I see it then?" she said. "I'm in a bit of a hurry." "Of course." He stood. "Sparrow's on her way into town. She's going to meet us at the stable down the street." Jenna followed the trader out of the inn and down the sidewalk, wondering if she was being led into some kind of a trap. "Is this leather worker one of your regular suppliers?" Jenna asked. "She is getting to be," he said. "I worked with her sister for several years, and now Sparrow is stepping into her shoes." The stable seemed to be nothing more or less than what he'd claimed it was, and just a little ramshackle. "Wait here," Shadow said, and disappeared inside. Jenna moved close to the window so that she could use her dragon-sharp ears to eavesdrop on the conversation. "She's here?" It was a female voice, quite young, a little panicky. "I thought it was going to be another week." "She made really good time," the trader said. "Let me see what you've done." Jenna heard footsteps, and when the girl spoke again, it was from farther away. "I used the measurements you gave, but I kept thinking I was somehow getting it wrong." "Sparrow," Shadow said, a hint of awe in his voice, something Jenna wouldn't have expected. "This is amazing work. If I didn't know better, I would think that Aspen—" "No," the girl said flatly. "There will never be anyone as skilled as she was." "How are the litlings doing?" he asked. "Mag still cries a lot, but the twins are beginning to forget. They were so young when she was killed. I'm keeping them all really busy." "So you're getting enough work? You have enough to eat?" Shadow was like a different Rogan, one with a heart. "Too much work, the litlings say," the girl laughed. "Even though I'm young, everyone knows I trained with Aspen, and so many of our best craftspeople have been killed. I don't have much time for hunting, but Fern keeps us well fed." "Good," Shadow said. They were walking again, their voices moving closer. "The buyer is outside. We shouldn't keep her waiting any longer." Jenna moved away from the window, just in time as Rogan walked out into the stable yard with a young clan girl, probably 12 or 13. "I'm Sparrow," the girl said gravely. "I'm Riley," Jenna said. Are you the harness maker?" I am, she said. Do not worry. I know what I am doing. I worked with my sister since I was 3. Her formal use of common told Jenna she didn't often speak it. That's not what Jenna trailed off, because that was exactly what she was worried about. I have your order ready. Let me show you. Sparrow led Jenna toward the back of the line of stalls, to where a large box stall had been made over into a kind of shop displaying bridles, belts, bags, and other leatherwork. It smelled of leather, which brought back memories of Fletcher's tack and harness. A large bundle wrapped in leather lay on the bench. Beside it lay the most exquisite saddle Jenna had ever seen. Lightweight, yet with enough structure to give her a good seat in flight, and lined with sheep's wool. I used the dimensions you gave me and rigged it up the way you said, Sparrow said. Shadow said this was for a griffin. Right, Jenna lied. The only one in captivity. I'm with the circus. Sparrow kept her face blank and her voice neutral, displaying no trace of skepticism, as if she received orders to trick out griffins every day. She unwrapped the leather bundle. And here's the rest of the rigging, the bridle, plus the jacket and skirt you ordered. It was a short jacket lined in sheepskin and cured to shed water. It wasn't armor, exactly, but Jenna hoped it would turn away the cold and wind, and yet give her the freedom of movement she needed, and a split skirt, almost like chaps, that would keep her legs warm and offer them some protection, she hoped. I always measure twice, Sparrow said, but you'll still want to try those on. As for the tack, I like to have a try-on, so I can make any adjustments you need before you. That won't be necessary, Jenna said. I left Griff back on the coast with the rest of the circus. You can't bring a circus through the gorge. Couldn't you just fly here, on the griffin? Shadow asked. No, Jenna said. I didn't want to chance it until I got my new tack. That's why I didn't want to travel all the way here. Plus, he's on a special diet. Just stop now, Jenna told herself. Don't get too fancy. Then how are you going to get this lot back to the coast? Shadow asked. Jenna was stumped for a minute. Well, I thought I'd hire a wagon and... It happens that I'm heading for Chalk Cliffs now, Shadow said. Would you like to ride along? We can haul your equipment, too. The trader was being too damned helpful. Jenna was a pretty fair liar, but she was used to lying about everyday things, not griffins and dragons and the like. She resolved to stick to basics in the future. How about we'll just settle up and I'll work that out on my own? She said. What do I owe you? Sparrow looked at Shadow, and he nodded, his dark, suspicious eyes fixed on Jenna. Sparrow named her price, and Jenna counted out the money. I hope this is all worth it, Jenna thought, as she toiled back up the trail toward her camping spot, her new purchases draped across her back. I hope I'll be able to be more than a passenger when I don't have to worry so much about holding on. When it comes to fighting back against the Empress, I have a feeling we're going to need every edge we can get. 26. A hard road to the coast. Travels with the trader got off to a rocky start. Brion had hoped to ride in the back of the wagon with the cargo, so he'd be less visible, but their driver was having none of that. You'll sit up here with me or get down and walk, the trader said. Could I at least put my rucksack in the... No. Either he had a briar up his bunghole, or there was goods in that wagon that he didn't want them to see. It might be Leaf, though Leaf usually went the other way, from the coast to the Midlands. Brion was keen to take a peek. But something about the trader's eyes made Brion reluctant to tangle with him. You don't want to get off on the wrong foot, he told himself. It's hard enough to get a ride. So Brion sat with his bag containing his jafasa between his knees. Aubrey snuggled up against him and fell immediately asleep. It was as if, when asleep, she forgot that she was mad at him. She seemed friendlier now than she had been. Maybe it was because they were finally on the next to last leg of their journey. Brian tried to start up a conversation with the trader. "They call me Bree," he said. The trader grunted. "And you are?" "Shadow." "Where are you from?" "Marisa Pine's camp." It must have been plain that Brian had no idea where that was, because he added grudgingly, "In the uplands." "What's your cargo?" "Trade goods." "You planning to sell that lot in Chalk Cliffs?" "Maybe," the trader said. "Do you ever have trouble getting across the border?" "No." Shadow showed his teeth in a dangersome, shark-like smile, which at least was more of an answer than he'd volunteered so far. "We'll be looking for passage on a ship from Chalk Cliffs to Baston Bay," Brian said, changing the subject. "Do you think it'll be a problem finding a berth this time of year?" "I don't know," the trader said. And then maybe nosiness was catching, because he poked at the instrument case. "What is in the bag?" Brian was in no hurry to show off the broken Jafasa. Traders were usually in on the latest news, and maybe he'd heard about the murder in Southbridge, and maybe he'd seen the drawing of the Jafasa, and maybe he'd like to collect a reward. Brian was prepared with a story at least. "I'm selling the finest clan-made walking staffs," he said. "Hand-carved and magicked for strength, so they'll never break, warp or rot." He extended the walking stick he'd nicked at the market. "See? Give this a try. When you hold this in your hand, you'll know you're holding quality." The trader made no move to take the staff. "If you paid a clan-made price for that, you were robbed," he said, snorting. "You're wrong," Brian said, conjuring up a wounded expression. "This is the genuine article. I got it direct from a copperhead." "Who got it direct from a Tamarick sweatshop?" "Hang on." Brian began fumbling with the fasteners on his Jafasa case. "If you don't fancy this one, I've got plenty more in my—" "Never mind," the trader said, dismissing him. With that small victory, Brian quit pressing his luck. He settled back, closed his eyes, and let the movement of the wagon lull him to sleep. It didn't take long for him to realize that it was a stroke of luck that matched them up with the trader, since it was likely they wouldn't have made it through the eastern passes without him. He might look like a southern islander, but he proved he was at home in the mountains in a dozen ways. He provided clan waybread and dried venison that could keep you going on an all-day trek. He found game where it seemed like nothing could possibly survive. He could build a fire in a snowdrift, and it didn't smoke at all. He found them shelter from a storm under a tree with branches that swooped all the way to the ground. When the snows grew too deep to plow through with the wheels, he brought out runners from a compartment under the bed of the wagon, the kind of compartment that smugglers use. The trader positioned his body so Brian couldn't see down inside, while he helped attach them to the wagon so they could forge on. It was hard to help and keep up his gimpy guise, but the trader probably assumed Brian was a slacker anyhow, so he didn't ask questions. Until they got closer to Chalk Cliffs. Then he got real nosy. "What was your name again? Bree?" Brian nodded. "Where are you from? I can't place your accent." Brian had no idea where he was from, but he wasn't going to start that conversation. "I'm from the coast, farther south. Baston Bay, where it's a lot warmer than this." Shadow eyed him, as if judging the weight of his purse. "If you've got some coin for passage, I know some masters and factors who might be able to help you." "For real?" Brian said. "That'd be—" "We have our own contacts," Aubrey said. "Our own plans. Thanks, anyway." Brian gave her a "what's up with you" kind of look. "Come on now, it can't do any harm to hear what they have to say. Maybe we can get a better price." "I'm just saying, it's a waste of time because— And if your contact aren't there, what then?" Brian turned to Shadow. I'll talk to your friends and see what's on offer. Then we'll decide." The trader shrugged, as if he didn't care one way or the other. "Fair enough, but I have a stop to make first." Being close to the border between Arden and the Fells, Chalk Cliffs was more like a fortress than a typical harbor town. It was surrounded by massive stone walls and perched high on the cliffs overlooking the harbor below. The bluejackets at the gate questioned Shadow long and hard, then escorted him into the little guardhouse next to the gate for more talk. Brian kept his hat pulled low and slumped down in his seat, glad it was the trader and not him who was being questioned in the guardhouse. Still, the siren scent of the sea was in his nose, and his heart beat a little faster, and the blood sang in his veins. Almost there. Wide awake now, Aubrey took his arm. "Let's just go," she said. "We'll find us a place to stay and go down to the harbour on our own. There's a captain I know who's likely in port right now. If not now, he soon will be." Brian stared at her. As far as he knew, Aubrey had never been to Chalk Cliffs. How would she know a captain who would be in port? Was that part of the game she had going? "We haven't paid Shadow yet," Brian said, "and he's given us good value for what we agreed on. I aren't going to stiff him." "I don't know," Aubrey said. "I've just got this bad feeling." And then it was too late, because the trader had emerged from the guardhouse. "We're good," he said, climbing up into the seat again. "There's a couple of ship's captains who stay at this place I know of down by the waterfront when they're in port. We'll go there now." So there was nothing to do but ride along. They pulled up in front of a seedy-looking tavern 2 streets away from the harbor front. "I'll be just a minute," he said, swinging down from the driver's seat. "I'll see if they're there." He disappeared into the dim interior. As soon as he was gone, Aubrey slid down onto the street. "Keep watch for him coming back. I'm going to see what he's hiding in the back." "I'm in enough trouble as is," Brian hissed. "You're in trouble," Aubrey said. "I'm not." "Look, he's done us a kindness, and that's not the way to repay it," Brian said. "I just want a quick look. It's not like I'm planning to steal anything." She winked, then sidled along the side of the wagon and lifted the tarp that covered the wagon bed so she could crawl underneath. With growing misgivings, Brian watched the door of the tavern for the trader's return. Several people came and went, but not Shadow. He could hear Aubrey rummaging around in the back of the wagon, the boards creaking under her weight. "Blood and bones," she muttered. "Will you look at that?" "Come on out of there," Brian hissed. "Whatever he's got, it aren't worth it." That's when he heard the tavern door bang open and looked up to see Shadow striding toward the wagon. "Aubrey!" Brian hissed. He heard her quick intake of breath, then the thud as her feet hit the cobblestones, then her voice. "Meet me at the Grey Goose." Then she was gone. Brian slid down off the seat and met Shadow halfway between, hoping to draw his attention away from the wagon. "Well," he said, "did you see anyone you know?" Shadow's big hand settled onto Brian's shoulder. "This is your lucky day," he said with a tight smile. "There's people in there I want you to meet." His eyes swept over the wagon. "Where'd your friend go?" "I went to the privy behind the inn, and when I come back she was gone. I know there was a ship's master she wanted to go see. Maybe that's where she went." Shadow took another good look around the inn yard. "Why would she leave without telling you?" Brian shrugged. "Why does she do most of the things she does?" he said, making it clear he wasn't her nanny. "Anyway, I think she's mad at me. Well, let's go on in and see what we can find out," the trader said, scooping up the bag with Brian's instrument and handing it to him. "You don't want anybody running off with this while we're inside," the trader said, by way of explanation. "There's a lot of slide-handers around here." By now, alarm bells were ringing inside Bree's head. It didn't help that Shadow kept one hand on Brian's shoulder all the way to the inn door. "You know what?" Brian said. "I think I need to go back to the privy. I'll meet you inside." He tried unsuccessfully to pull free. Shadow's hand tightened on his shoulder. "You can shortcut it straight through the inn," he said, hauling open the door and pushing him inside, so he all but fell on his face. Brian knew he was in trouble when a pair of ham-like hands grabbed him and slammed him up against the wall. They patted him down, none too gently, searching for weapons, ignoring his protests. They took away the little shiv he kept for emergencies, and his pouch of leaf. Turning his head, he saw that there was just the three of them in the room, Shadow, Brian, and a bluejacket the size of a large tree. He took a second look and was astonished to see that it was a girlie. She was familiar, somehow, like maybe she'd slammed him up against a wall before. "He's got to be the one," the tree said. "He looks familiar, and he fits the description." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. It was a smaller version of the posters Brian had seen. They both looked from the drawing to Brian and back again, while Brian tried to look as little like the picture as he could, which wasn't hard, since it wasn't even a good likeness. "Where's that instrument you said he had with him?" Shadow set Brian's bag on the table and unfastened the catches. He lifted out the splintered Jafasa and held it up for the other one to see. Even though it was broken, it matched the drawing just fine. "Be careful with that," Brian said. "I got that from my father." "Well, it looks to me like you didn't take very good care of it," the bluejacket said. Brian thought of telling her he wasn't the one that broke it, but guessed it wouldn't do him any good. She went right back to searching him, taking her time on this round. Shadow seemed to be studying the broken Jafasa, as if trying to figure out how to work it. "Give it here and I'll show you how to play it," Brian said, figuring it couldn't hurt to ask. Shadow just snorted and went on with his examination. It was then that the tree found Brian's shine, Her Highness's locket and the pendant he'd got from his father. Uttering an oath that any tannery hand would be proud of, she ripped them off over Brian's head. She thrust the locket into his face. "Explain that, you goat-strumming lowlife!" That's what he got for trying to hold on to anything. "I bought it off a picaroon in the capital," Brian lied. "He was starving, so I did him a favor. He said it was his grandmother's." "So, you admit you were recently in the capital?" "Ask your friend Shadow. He's the one gave me a ride along the road." Now the tree dangled Brian's pendant in front of him. "Who'd you steal this from?" "I didn't steal it. It belonged to my father, too." The tree eyed it suspiciously. "It looks like it's broken. Where's the rest of it?" "It's always been like that, far as I know," Brian said. "What does it do? Is it a compass or what? I don't know what it does. It's never done anything for me, but lend me a little extra shine." Words surfaced in his head, like bodies on the water. "Keep this with you, and you can always find your way home." Brian, hoping she'd give it back, stuck out his hand, but she tucked it away in her pocket. She kept on patting him down, and eventually she discovered the mage mark on the back of his neck. "What the bloody hell is this?" First she poked at it, and when nothing happened, she began prying at it, trying to pull it loose. Finally, she pulled out her shiv and tried to slide it underneath until Brian could feel blood running down under his shirt. "Blood and bones," he said, trying to twist away. "It don't come off. I should know. I've had it all my life. It would have been sold off by now if it did." "It might be some kind of flashcraft," Shadow said, getting his own poke in. "What is this blue stone? Is this a sapphire? Aquamarine?" "I don't know a sapphire from a hunk of glass," Brian thought. "I don't know. I've never even seen it." "Is this platinum?" Shadow tapped the metal framing with his finger. "I don't know," Brian said. "If it was anything valuable, somebody would have slit my throat for it by now." The trader closed his hand over it, as if trying to read it through his fingers. At least he didn't try to rip it off. "What does it do?" he asked Brienne. "Nothing, far as I know," Brienne said, though he'd always wondered if it had something to do with his vast personal charm and extraordinary talent. Maybe it's some kind of a permanent amulet? Shadow sat back on his heels. "You think he's a wizard?" The bluejacket backed off a little, then tried to pretend she hadn't. "Damn right I am," Brienne said. "You'd better be nice to me, or I'll turn you both into carbuncles on a pig's ass." That earned Brienne a punch in the nose. Shadow had to step in to prevent the bluejacket from going on with smashing his head into the oak bar. "Talbot!" Shadow grabbed the bluejacket's arm. "I know that you're angry about Lys, which is all the more reason we need him alive and well enough for questioning. He hasn't been convicted of anything. Yet." His expression said that it was just a matter of time. For a mixed-blood smuggler, Shadow seemed very tight with this bluejacket. In no time they had his hands shackled together and his ankles too. "I'll send a bird to Fellsmarsh and find out what Captain Byrne wants done with him," Talbot the tree growled. "Maybe they'll send a wizard to check out his tattoo or brooch or whatever it is. In the meantime, we'll keep him nice and cozy in the guardhouse." Her glare said that it wouldn't be all that cozy, and not nice either, if she had anything to do with it. "I think it's best if we keep this quiet until they come from the capital to claim him," Shadow said. "Whoever hired him won't want him talking to us. If they hear that we've got him, they'll try to either kill him or spring him. Let's take him over to the lockup now and get him out of sight. I have some business to handle tonight, but I'll ask him a few questions tomorrow before I leave for the Down Realms. His partner might come here looking for him," Shadow added. "She's Ardenine, brown hair, broken nose, about 16 years old, and her name is Aubrey." He did that thing with his hands that people do to depict a curvy woman. "Tell your guards to be on the lookout for her. We'll want to question her too." "What made you suspect him?" Talbot asked Shadow as she hauled Brienne to his feet, nearly wrenching his arm out of its socket. "I was curious about his bag," Shadow said. "He didn't seem to want anybody else to touch it, and I wondered why he was so jumpy. So I took a look the first night." So Rogan swiving shadow dancers known all along, Brienne thought, and here I was sticking up for him. I hope Aubrey robbed him blind. Sorry, Aubrey, he thought. I won't be meeting you at the Grey Goose any time soon. 27. Clash of Swords. In the days that followed the liberation of Delphi, Lys kept having to remind herself that they were the ones who had won. Sometimes she felt like the victim of a cruel joke. She'd never realized that the end of any battle is just a prelude to more politics. Her mother had sent warm congratulations. She ordered that Delphi be welcomed as an ally and ruled with a light hand. The plan was to put the territory under martial law until it could be transitioned to self-rule. Then, in a nasty move, she named Lys to represent the queendom in the negotiations. I want you to own this, and not because I want you to get the blame if it goes wrong. I want you to know how it feels to make a decision and live with the consequences, good or bad. In other words, every victory has its price. When you win, you have to quit fighting and rule. So here she was, sitting in meeting after dreary meeting, discussing coal production targets, road building, food distribution, and medical services. She might as well be at home. At least there she knew where the broken stones were in the castle wall. At home, if someone stabbed her in the back, she at least might have a guess who it was. Dealing with the Delphians was like herding angry cats. As long as Arden held the city in its iron grip, that common enemy united the people. Now that the occupiers were gone, the realm seemed destined to descend into internecine squabbling. Old disputes rose up like festering boils on the civic skin. The population had a massive grudge against Arden, its Blackbird Guard and its Mudback Army, with some left over for anyone perceived to have cooperated with them. The former mayor was found dead in an alley, his throat cut, his body wrapped in an Ardenine flag. The mine supervisor was found buried under several tons of coal. It got to the point that Delphian collaborators begged to be taken into custody for their own protection, but the city jails were already bulging. That required attention too, sorting out who should stay and who should be released. To Lys's surprise, Juliana was a major help. She seemed to thrive on all the jobs that Lys detested. She remembered every name, and she managed mind-numbing details with cool efficiency, pushing people until they discovered common ground. Her natural charm seemed to grease every wheel that squeaked. Lys missed Sasha. Sparring with her might work off some tension. At least she'd listen to her complaints without trying to fix them. But first Sasha and later Finn had been dispatched on to Chalk Cliffs to join the garrison there in case Arden tried to bring reinforcements in by sea, as they had before. So these days Lys had to wear herself out with long patrols, slogging through deep snow and sparring matches with less challenging opponents. When I am queen, she thought, I'll keep my friends close, and my enemies closer. She caught her breath. When I am queen? When had she started thinking of that as something she might actually look forward to? One clear, cold morning, Lys and a triple of gray wolves rode up to the army headquarters. It was in a manor house north of town, now occupied by the Felsian Highlanders. The survivors of the Ardenine army were being held up there, both because it offered the only guardhouse large enough to hold them, and to protect them from the angry population. General Dunedain's staff and Juliana's eyes and ears had been debriefing the Ardenine prisoners, gathering what intelligence they could about troop strength and weaponry. Lys often sat in. Maybe I can't ride into Arden and kill King Gerard, but I can find out as much about the enemy as possible, she thought, with the added bonus that it got her out of the city and its endless meetings. When they reached the stable yard, Lys handed off her pony and strode toward the manor house. Before she reached it, she was distracted by the clatter of sword on sword and the shouts of onlookers. Following the noise, she came upon Halston Matalon and a Highlander going at it with heavy wooden longswords. A mixed crowd of soldiers stood watching, the Mudbacks cheering on their commander, and the Highlanders shouting encouragement to their own man. Despite the cold weather, they were both steaming in the cold air and breathing hard, so they'd been at it for a while. There was an intensity to the bout that said it was more than a casual match. Matalon's raven wing hair was plastered to his forehead, and sweat ran down his face and under his uniform collar. Just then the Highlander turned, and Lys saw his face. Blood and bones, she thought. It's Bosley. Clearly, Matalon had found a way to get under the young officer's admittedly thin skin. That's it, Matalon was saying, like a teacher to a pupil. Don't fix on what I'm doing now. Think about what I'm going to do, and keep moving to counter. That way you— Shut the hell up! I'm here to school you, not the other way around. I don't need some slime-bellied mudback to tell me how to use a sword. What's this all about, anyway? Why are these two sparring with each other? Lys edged forward for a better view. When the Highlanders saw who it was, they hastily stepped aside to let her through. Bosley tried a quick jab inside Matalon's reach. Matalon leapt backward, and even Lys could tell the tip was inches short, but Bosley crowed, "Hit!" The Mudbacks exploded into shouts and catcalls, but Matalon just shrugged. "All right, if you say so." Bosley thrust his chin forward. "Are you questioning my call?" If he's not, I am, Lys thought. I would never insult a man by questioning his call, Matalon said. He resumed his ready stance. Shall we? This time, Matalon's sword was everywhere, cutting and thrusting, a blur of motion. He called out 3 hits in as many minutes in a flat, almost bored voice. The Ardenine was damned good. It made Lys wonder if he'd been holding back before. "That wasn't a hit," Bosley said after the third was called. "That was a miss." A low rumble of disapproval rolled through the Southerners. Matalon raised an eyebrow. "I see," he said, eyes narrowed, spots of temper blooming on his cheeks. "I stand corrected." Lys scowled in disgust. She wanted to root for her own man, but Bosley was making it difficult. The next time Bosley tried for a hit, Matalon countered with a fierce blow, and the Highlander's sword went flying. Bosley retrieved his weapon and tried again, with the same result. "Bloody bones!" Bosley swore when it happened a third time. "That's not proper swordsmanship! Are you a mind reader or what?" Matalon picked up the fallen sword and handed it back to Bosley. "I'm no mind reader," he said, "but you signal what you're going to do before you do it, every single time." "I do not," Bosley said, sticking out his chin. Yes, you do, Lys thought, embarrassed at Bosley's bad showing and poor sportsmanship. "Very well, Lieutenant," Matalon said. "You are correct. I can see inside your head, and likely so can all of your opponents. Perhaps you should talk the Copperheads into making you a magical helmet." The Mudbacks doubled up laughing, and the lieutenant's face went purple with rage. Bosley charged forward, swinging the flat of his blade at Matalon's head. The Southerner sidestepped nimbly, but stuck out his foot, and this time it was Bosley himself who went flying, skidding some distance through the snow on his face, until he came up against the stable wall. Bosley rose onto his knees. "Pin his arms," he growled, reaching for his sword. Lys planted her boot on it. "Stand down, Lieutenant," she said. "You're done here." Bosley looked up, his face contorted into a snarl that drained away in an almost comical fashion when he saw who was standing over him. "Captain, I didn't realize that you were here." "Obviously," Lys said. Bosley scrambled to his feet, leaving his practice blade in the snow, and got off a combined bow and salute. His lieutenant's scarf was layered in slush, and his face scraped and reddened by his face-first slide. "Does Captain Barnes know that you are sparring with Captain Matalon?" "He doesn't specifically know it," Bosley said. "Meaning he doesn't know it at all?" Matalon and we were just giving the troops a skills demonstration," Bosley said, shooting a warning look at Matalon, as if daring him to disagree. The Ardenine tightened his jaw and said nothing, but his body was as taut as a drawn bowstring. "Indeed you were, Bosley, but I don't know what exactly it was you were trying to demonstrate," Lys said. "Were you aware that Captain Matalon is the son of an Ardenine Thane and a prisoner of war? Had you considered the strategic cost to us if he were to be injured or killed?" Bosley stared at her for a long moment, as if considering and discarding several possible responses. Finally, he gathered his wits and said, "That's why I held back, Your Highness, so as not to hurt him. Had I known that the captain was such a fragile bit of crockery, I would have found a sturdier opponent." Too late, Lys realized that she'd handed the lieutenant a weapon and an excuse. When she looked into Matalon's gray-green eyes, she was reminded of the expression, "if looks could kill." Unable to undo the damage or conjure up a suitable reply, she said, "You are dismissed, Bosley." He bowed again, with more grace this time, collected both swords and strutted off like the cock of the walk, leaving Lys, her guard, Captain Matalon, and a dozen gawking soldiers. "The rest of you as well, go on." She waved the audience away. Matalon bowed curtly. "By your leave, Captain," and went to turn away. "I didn't mean you, Matalon," she said. When he turned back, his face stony, she added, "I want to hear what you have to say." "About?" He cocked his head. "I want to hear your side of the story." Matalon dabbed at a cut on his chin that he had acquired along the way. "I have no side," Lieutenant Bosley told you what happened. It would be inappropriate for me to comment." It was like he chewed on each word before he spit it out. "I apologize for Bosley's behavior," Liz said. Matalon shifted his weight from foot to foot, obviously eager to be on his way. "Forgive me, ma'am, but if you think Bosley's behavior was improper, you should be speaking to him and not to me." With that, Liz's temper snapped. "Follow me, Captain, and that is an order." Turning to her wolves, she said, "Drag him if he doesn't come on his own." Liz stalked toward the manor house without looking to see if he was behind her. Eventually, she heard his boots crunching through the snow, following after. 28. Clash of Words. Hal, his heart sinking like a stone, followed after Captain Gray. He should have better managed his temper, but it wasn't easy. Idleness drove him mad. He was not a happy captive. It didn't make much sense for Gray to be leading the way, since Hal knew the garrison headquarters a lot better than she did. He'd lived there for nearly a year. If she'd just tell him where she wanted to go, he could get them there. But as it was, he followed after her like an obedient dog going to be put down. As they walked, Hal ran his eyes over the damage done to his former headquarters. He'd been so proud of the improvements he'd made since his arrival in Delphi. Now his palisade was a charred ruin, which demonstrated the power of wizard's flame against walls of wood. The Northerners were rebuilding with stone. There was plenty of that around. Stone next time, he thought. He couldn't help himself, couldn't believe that there wouldn't be a next time. He'd never been good at losing. Now he'd made things worse by drawing Gray's attention again. She'd made it plain the day they'd met that she bore a giant grudge against Arden. He didn't want her to be taking an interest in him. His duty as a prisoner of war was to protect his men and escape if he could. She'd saved his life twice now. Why? His biggest worry was that she intended to use him in a way that would dishonor his family name. Would the Northern witches fashion him into a weapon that could be wielded against his homeland? The thought made his skin crawl. "I'll kill myself before I betray my command," he told himself. The church frowned on suicide, but Hal had never been all that well churched anyway. A church that burned people to save their souls would surely understand the difficult choice before him. After the brilliant, brittle cold of the grounds, the interior of the mansion seemed oppressive, the air too thick with heat and magic to breathe. Gray shed clothes as she walked, her gloves, hat, scarf, and finally her thick outer coat, draping it over her arm. Water dripped onto the stone floor as the frozen bits layering her coat melted. Underneath, she wore Copperhead-style clothing, leather trousers that fit her long legs closely, and a loose overshirt of embroidered wool. Hal liked the way she walked, with long strides, so a man didn't have to mince along in her wake. He'd thought maybe they would go to the Great Hall, where the Northerners had established their military command. She did pause briefly and speak to the soldiers standing guard at the entrance, but then she walked on past, into a corridor that led toward the back of the house. Her usual small escort followed along behind. Hal glanced back at them, feeling more comforted than dismayed by their presence. That's when Hal realized that they were heading for the library, where he'd spent a lot of time during his residence here. He'd done considerable reading, trying to learn more about mining and iron-making, so he wouldn't have to rely on the corrupt officials in charge of production to make good decisions. "Even if the job you're assigned is not to your liking, a Matalon will see it done." His father had drilled that into him from a young age. The library was deserted. The only light was what leaked in around the heavy shutters. Gray walked around the room, throwing the shutters open to spill in light and fresh air. Hal stood ramrod straight in the middle of the room, fists clenched. "Why did you bring me here?" he thought. Though he'd had a taste of ruthless politics at the Ardenine court, he was, like his father, a soldier at heart. When the captain had the room lit to her liking, she waved her guard to the other side of the room and gestured to a pair of chairs under the window. "Sit, Captain," she said. "If you don't mind, ma'am, I'd prefer to—" "I intend to sit, and I won't have you standing over me." She claimed the chair closest to the window, so that the light poured over her. Closing her eyes, she basked in the sunlight like a cat. Without opening her eyes, she said, "Your gutta-swiving king has taught me to dread the dark days of midwinter." What does she mean? We never march north in midwinter. Also, Hal couldn't remember ever hearing a lady use the term gutter-swiving. He sat in the other chair, taking advantage of the opportunity to take another good look at her. Her fawn-colored hair was sun-streaked from long days spent outdoors. Now it was done up copperhead style, the multiple braids decorated with beads and feathers. 1 braid per kill. Wasn't that the rule? Hal couldn't help himself. He began to count. Right then, the princess opened her eyes to catch him leaning forward from the edge of his chair, looking at her. He reared back in his chair and shifted his eyes away. Saints and martyrs, he thought. "Would you like something to drink, Captain?" Gray said. "You must be thirsty after your bout." Hal knew better than to accept that kind of offer. "I prefer to drink from the common well, Captain," he said. "I've advised my men to do the same." Gray looked perplexed for a moment, then apparently worked it out, because she scowled. Damn, he should have just said he wasn't thirsty. He wasn't here to yank anyone's tail, not if he hoped to survive. "Do you really think we would feed and house you for a week, and then poison you? That would be damned inefficient." Hal didn't look at her. He was worried he might reveal too much if he met her gaze. "Perhaps not a potion to kill, but one to turn us into something we're not." "You mean like a toad or a billy goat?" Her lips twitched, as if it was all she could do not to burst out laughing. "I know, a flock of chickens. We could use some fresh eggs around here." Hal stared at her. Did she really not understand what he was talking about? "We've heard stories of spells and potions that steal a man's courage or his strength, that cause him to turn against his fellow soldiers and kill them, that give him such a massive case of the itches that—" "Believe me, Captain, if I had that power, I would have sent you all home with the itches a long time ago," Gray said, wiping at her eyes. With that, she made one of her abrupt turns. "Now tell me about you and Bosley." She tilted her head back and looked down her nose at him. Hal sighed. He had no desire to entangle himself in this. He'd overheard Bosley bragging to his fellow soldiers that he and Gray were lovers. Bosley had described a series of recent trysts with her in embarrassingly graphic detail. Maybe customs were different here in the north, but it seemed crude and dishonorable to share that. He couldn't fathom what Gray saw in Bosley, but it was none of his business after all. Then why did he spend so much time thinking about it? "Captain," Gray said, bringing him out of the bedchamber and back to the library. Hal cleared his throat. "I'd organized some tournaments for my men, to keep them occupied and to give them something to look forward to," he said. "It started with practice swords and quarterstaves, but later we added foot races and wrestling, stone-slinging, whatever they wanted to do with what we had available." He wiped his damp palms on his breeches. "I put up a standings board and passed out ribbons to the winners. The first day it was just a handful, but the next day more turned out, and then still more. Soon they were organizing events on their own, and coming up with prizes that they—" Hal stopped, took a breath. He was proud of what he'd done, but that didn't mean Gray was interested. Yet she nodded thoughtfully. "So you improved both the morale and the physical conditioning of your soldiers?" she said. Smart. Then, one day, during the games, some Highlanders approached and asked if I could include them in our bouts. I wasn't keen on the idea, but they persisted, saying that they, could use more training than they were getting. As it turned out, they were in Bosley's command. He looked up at Gray. Don't get me wrong, ma'am. I'm not criticizing anyone. I just— Stipulated, she said, sitting back and resting her hands, palms up, on the arms of her chair. He couldn't help noticing how calloused her hands were from the use of weapons. He'd never met a high-born woman with hands like that. He wondered what it would be like to have a go in the practice yard with, I said stipulated, Captain. Do go on. He looked up, blinking, then realized that he'd been staring. So Bosley's soldiers began participating in some of the tournaments. Having a larger group was good, because I could switch off the matchups, and it seems you have no problem sleeping with the enemy. Hal's face heated, his mouth went dry, and he shifted in his chair. Ma'am, he said hoarsely. You know what I mean. What would your father say if he saw you training Felsian soldiers? She'd chosen those words on purpose. She was toying with him. Hal tried to control his temper. My father would approve of my learning more about Felsian training methods and military practices. He would be glad I wasn't sitting on my ass getting soft. To summarize, ma'am, my father would have no problem with it, but Lieutenant Bosley apparently did. What makes you think that? Damn again. He'd meant to keep his report totally neutral. If Bosley was sleeping with his commanding officer, the last thing Hal wanted was to get caught in that crossfire. Too late. He was too far in to take it back. But maybe he could regain some ground. Somehow, the lieutenant got word of what was going on, so he came to the session this morning and suggested that the two of us have a go to, demonstrate proper form. She worried at one of her nails with her teeth. Why do you think that Lieutenant Bosley disapproved of your sessions with his soldiers? Hal hesitated. Maybe you should ask the— I'm asking you. Hal tried to think of a way to put a more positive face on it. I guess he thought I was interfering with his way of doing things, or poking in where I had no business. Did you readily agree to the demonstration? Ma'am, did Bosley give you a choice? Sweat trickled between Hal's shoulder blades. Captain Gray had a way of cutting all the way to the bone. You can tell the truth, Captain, she said softly, looking straight into his eyes. This is between us. And somehow he found himself saying, I didn't think it was a good idea for us to have a go. I told him I wouldn't include his soldiers anymore if he didn't like it. I tried to get out of it, but the lieutenant was— He insisted. He wanted to show you up? You should ask— When Gray scowled at him, he gave in. I suspect so, ma'am. If I was a smarter man, I would have found a way to lose to him. He paused. I don't like losing. Me neither, Captain. But you'd better get used to it. Ma'am, I'm going to drive your armies into the sea. It was as if they'd been sparring, and then all of a sudden she went for the throat. Why, because you have more magic on your side? He said, drawn in despite his determination not to be. If I had my way, it would be a fair fight, men against men, with no— He mimicked a spell-casting gesture. Men against men? Oh, right, I keep forgetting. You don't have women in your army. Hal couldn't seem to open his mouth without hitting a nerve. He darted a look at her. No, we don't, ma'am. He tried to think of something to add, to explain it. Our women are not like you. They are not well suited for battle. You might find out that they are more capable than you know. I'm not saying that women are incapable. I am saying that they are capable of different things. Captain Gray snorted. It's no wonder you're losing. Hal could feel the hot blood rising in him. She seemed to know just where to poke him. We lost a battle because we were outplayed, not the war. Your soldiers, both the Copperheads— clans, she corrected. Both the clans and the Highlanders fight hard, and they are some of the bravest soldiers I've ever met. No bit of ground is easily won. But face the facts. You are starving up here. At first I thought my men were being given lean prisoner rations. Then I realized they were getting the same as your own soldiers. We've managed, she said. Maybe it isn't fancy, but you cannot grow enough food to support yourselves, and now that we've deployed a navy, you won't be able to bring in foodstuffs by sea. We draw troops from every part of the Empire. Troops that really don't care whether you win or lose. Troops that just want to survive the war and go home, many of whom are unwilling conscripts. Is that why your own mages try to kill you? Would you like to go to war with a flashcraft collar around your neck? It's a little more complicated than that, Hal thought. But he wasn't going to tell this northern captain that his own king was gunning for him. And yet we've won control of the entire continent, except for a few outliers, he said. Our granaries are bulging, and we control the sources of iron and steel and gunpowder. What do you intend to fight with? We recently acquired some new coal mines and iron furnaces, she countered. Were you aware of that, Captain? Aye, you did, but you won't hold them for long. You are surrounded by enemies, and you can only live on courage for so long. You are going to lose, Captain. Time and everything else is on our side. Best to plan for it. Now she rose and paced back and forth, punctuating her speech by slamming her fist into her other palm. What would you have us do, Captain? Bend the knee after 25 years of war? Watch them slaughter the spirit clans and burn and collar our wizards? Turn our rivers into cesspools and build a Delphi in the middle of the Vale? She swiveled, her braids flying, and came and glared down at him. He tried to think of something encouraging to say. Ma'am, we are soldiers, you and I. There is always a need for soldiers. It might be that our lives wouldn't change much, no matter who sits on the throne. Even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Her expression said that he was impossibly naive. I am not a soldier in the eyes of your king, your church, and your commanders. Do you really think my life wouldn't change if Arden wins this war? What do you suppose would happen to our queen and our princess heir? You've been demonizing them for years, calling them witches and whores and sorceresses, and accusing them of all manner of foul deeds. Is there any way your war-weary people and your bloodthirsty church would allow them to live? She really cares about them, Hal thought. She loves her queen, that's plain to see. This is not just a job for her. Hal had always been a loyal soldier, but his relationship with King Gerard had nothing to do with love. It was duty. He'd never bought the church's argument that his king was anointed by the gods. Hal groped for a reply. How had they moved on to politics and religion, topics he was never comfortable with? In truth, he had no idea what would happen to the Felsian royals, but he wasn't optimistic, based on past experience. He had a duty to try to encourage the Northerners to surrender, but he couldn't bring himself to make any assurances about their safety. The church doesn't speak for everyone in Arden, Hal said, which was about as positive as he could make it. After the war, King Gerard will want to pacify the northern realms as quickly as possible. The Thanes, my father included, are weary of war as well, and more reluctant to contribute money and men to the cause. Captain Grey was nodding encouragingly. Hal stopped abruptly, realizing that he'd been ensnared into revealing too much. The Northerners didn't need to know how much pressure there had been in the South for an end to the war. But it was so hard to remember that she was his enemy, and not just a brave girl, a soldier, faced with an impossible choice. So, anyway, it might be that an advantageous marriage could be arranged that would bring the kingdom of the Fells into the fold. From the look on her face, He might have just asked her to bite into a turd. "Queendom, Captain," she spat. "This is a queendom. Your king made that offer to our queen more than 25 years ago. She refused him then, and he invaded, launching this war. Since then, Auden has murdered her husband and her daughter and—" She stumbled a bit. "And tried to kill her son." "This is war," Hal said. "People die. Even innocents die, unfortunately." It sounded weak, even to him, even though it was true. "I'm not talking about killing enemy soldiers in battle," Gray said. "I'm not even talking about civilians caught in the crossfire. I'm talking about Ardenine assassins sneaking into our cities and ambushing us on the street and in our beds." Hal had no idea what she was talking about, though it wouldn't surprise him to find out that King Gerard had employed that kind of tactic abroad as well as at home. This was the king who had won the throne by killing off his older brothers. This was the king who had sent Hal and his battalion of younglings on a suicide mission. Hal had signed on as a soldier, but he'd never signed on for the job of defending Gerard Montaigne. He found himself stumbling badly. "I don't know what you— Are you sure that they were attacked by agents of Auden? Isn't it possible that—" "When Princess Honalea was murdered, your king sent her head to her mother in a golden casket with a note, in case she didn't give credit where credit was due," Gray said. "This campaign of assassination has been going on for more than 4 years. She fixed him with a pair of brown eyes, hard as agates. "Frankly, Captain, I'd rather die than marry any son of Auden." 29. In lockup. They took Brian's Jafasa and his leaf and his shepherd's clothes and put him in mud-colored breeches and a shirt. They left his hands and feet loosely shackled so he could shuffle all around his little cell. They even brought him some books about ships when he asked for them. Encouraged, he asked for wood and tools for carving, but they didn't go for it. If he was going to survive this latest setback, if he was going to charm his way out of this, he was going to need an instrument to channel through. His voice wouldn't be enough to put a dent in these hard-hearted captors. And so far, he'd not been able to pinch anything from them that he could use to link to their music. To be fair, the lockup at Chalkcliff's Keep wasn't bad, as lockups go. Not that Briand had a wide experience, being mostly law-abiding, but he'd been in jail in Arden and Bruinswallow and Tamron, well, twice in Tamron, and this was top shelf in comparison. For one thing, it wasn't underground, it was in a tower, and he could hear the sea through his tiny barred window. The wind off the Indio was cold, but he didn't close his shutters, because he wanted to smell and hear the sea during what might be his last days. Even the food was decent that first night. Fish stew and bread to sop it up, and a leftover solstice cake. Brian ate it all, not knowing what plans they had for him, aware that this might be his last meal. Also because he was starving. Also because he had a special fondness for cake. They seemed to be having trouble rounding up important people to talk to him, ones that could be trusted anyway. Maybe they were all at some blue blood meeting. Still, he had a steady stream of visitors. First came a whole posse of bluejackets to empty his chamber pot, during which they eyed him like he might jump them at any moment. "How many bluejackets does it take to empty a chamber pot?" he wanted to ask, but thought better of it. A copperhead healer arrived, with her own escort of bluejackets to treat his black eye and bruised cheekbone. Brian asked if she'd ever thought of trying razor leaf to relieve pain, and she said no. Finally, Rogan the Rat Shadow Dancer barged in with his bluejacket mate Talbot the Tree, and a handsome young mage with striking silver hair, icy blue eyes, and a distinctive glow of magic. Brian eyed the new mage nervously. Why was he here? Brian happened to be sitting cross-legged on what passed for a bed, trying to fashion a whistle out of a piece of cork with the tip of a spoon. What are you doing? The trader demanded. Just passing the time, Brian said, like any dolt who might occupy his time by whittling a cork. Give it here, Shadow said, sticking out his hand. Brian handed it over, and Shadow put it into his pocket. Brian rolled his eyes. Leave a man a cork and he might poke you with it. Talbot rested her hand on the hilt of her sword. Poke me and I'll poke you back, you scaly, scum-sucking sneaksby. Brian cocked his head, nodded grudgingly. Impressive. She scowled. What? Your use of alliteration. Can you say that again? That scum-sucking thing. What in the bloody hell? No, Brian said, shaking his head. I'm looking for S-words. Opening his journal, he pretended to scan down a list. I've got slug strumming strammel and spoony sapskulled simpleton. He looked up brightly. Which do you prefer? Talbot lunged at him, but somehow Shadow got between them before she landed a blow. He gave her a talking to in a low voice, probably saying, Don't break it before we squeeze it dry. Brian couldn't say why he kept provoking her. He was like a littling who set things on fire just to watch them burn. Talbot finally settled herself. Still, she gripped the front of Brian's shirt and pulled him to his feet so they were eye to eye and nose to nose. I don't like you, she growled. I like you, he said, which might have been a bit of a stretch. Then again, let me be clear with you, Flatlander, Shadow said in a voice as cold as the northern sea. For years, your kind has been slithering into my homeland and murdering the people I care about. It's one thing to meet enemies on the battlefield. It's another to attack them on the streets or in their beds, to lure them with a pretty face and bewitching music. So, before this night is over, I will know everything you know about who hired you to lure the Princess Heir into an ambush. How quickly you tell me will determine your condition by the time we finish. Shadow hadn't been all that personable on the road, but now he'd shed whatever vestige of charm he'd shown before. He's lost someone in the war, some particular person, Brian thought. And you're the handy target who's going to end up dead if you can't keep your smart mouth shut. But it was hard to open his mouth and answer questions and keep the wrong thing from leaking out. Talbot pushed Brian down into a chair and darbied his hands to the arms. Brian was used to working an audience, and he was beginning to realize that being a smartass wasn't the right play here. He was beginning to realize that this might be his most important performance ever. I'll tell you what I know, he said. I've got nothing to hide, and nobody to protect. But what happens if I'm telling the truth and you think I'm lying? That won't happen, the new mage said, gazing at Brian like he was a nasty problem that needed solving. I'll use persuasion to make sure of it. Cold sweat trickled between Brian's shoulder blades. What did he mean by persuasion? Magic? Torture? Hypnosis? Could this mage really make him tell the truth? How much of the truth would he have to tell? Somehow the truth always made him look bad. Sometimes a bit of a spin helped too. I don't believe we've met, he said to the mage. I'm Finn Sulmander, the mage said. What's your name, busker? It's Brion, but I sometimes go by Bree. Brion what? Talbot sat forward, feet planted, like she was ready to pounce when Brion slipped up. Brion de Tarvos, Brion said. Does that mean you're from Tarvos? Shadow asked. Brion knew it wouldn't play well to tell them he had no idea where he was from, so he said, Yes. I mean, I assume so, hence the name. Where is Tarvos? Shadow said. Bloody bones. Who knew there'd be a geography question? It's on the seashore, he said. A harbour. I don't remember much about it. Warm brown sandstone. A sea so blue it hurt the eyes. Brilliant sunshine and cool shadow. Let me see this mage mark I've been hearing about, Sulmander said, scooting his stool closer. Brian leaned forward, the image of cooperation. The mage ran his fingers over the mage mark, but at least he didn't try to pry it off the way Talbot had done. What do you know about this? Sulmander said, tapping at it with his finger. Did somebody fasten this on to you? It's a birthmark, far as I know, Brian said. I've had it as long as I can remember. I know that it's fancier than most. Is anyone else in your family marked like this? I don't know. I assume I'm an orphan. The first memories I have are running the streets in Baston Bay, trying to stay alive. Have you ever met anyone else with this mark? The mage persisted. In Arden or elsewhere? Not that I know of. I mean, people don't usually go around showing off their necks. Could it be some kind of built-in amulet? I don't know, Brian said. No matter how many times you ask me, it's the truth. Now, Brian felt a burning sensation, as if Sulmander were heating the metal, and he tried to shift away. Ow! He said finally. Are you trying to melt it or what? Finn, Shadow said. Could we move on to the attack on Princess Alyssa? Finn reached out and pressed his right hand over Brian's, cradling his amulet with the other. Heat poured in through the mage's fingers, shooting through Brian like blue ruin. But at the end of it, he felt no different. It was like it came and went and left nothing behind. That wasn't so bad, Brian thought. Maybe magic is vastly overrated, like so many other things. Finn frowned, as if puzzled. Well, Talbot said, leaning forward. It's not working, Finn said. He's resisting it. I'm not resisting, Brian said, stung. I'm an open book. Ask me a question. Turning his head from side to side, he mimicked both sides of an interrogation. Young man, tell us what happened the night the princess was attacked. I'd be glad to, Your Honor. I don't have to ask you a question to know that it's not working, Finn said flatly. And your answers mean nothing if we don't know that you're telling the truth. The only thing worse than lying and getting caught was telling the truth and being called a liar. Did you search him? Finn said. Could he be wearing or carrying a talisman against high magic? We took a pendant off him, Talbot said. That was all. She patted him down again, just to make sure. Unless it's that thing on his neck that's interfering. She made it sound like the mage mark was an ugly wart or a tumor. Pulling out a wicked knife, she said, I could try to pry it off him again. Brian pulled in his head like a turtle and strained at the darbies fastening his wrists to the chair. I told you, it doesn't come off. It's too risky, Shadow said. We don't want to kill him before we get some answers. What about after? Brian thought, as Talbot put the blade away. Let me try again, Finn said, opening the magical floodgates once more. I'm trying to break through the barriers, but I don't want to injure him. No, Brian thought, you don't. Brian felt the burn again, scouring out his insides, so that he felt like he did after suffering through a bad case of the trots. But at the end of it, he felt no more likely to tell the truth than usual. Finn sat back, rubbing his chin and frowning. Strange. What's strange? Talbot eyed Brian like he was indeed something strange. It doesn't seem like I'm connecting with him. We've only just met, Brian thought. These things take time. Seriously, though, he had no idea why Finn's magic wouldn't work on him, and why he wouldn't at least try to ask a question. If we're not connecting, then how do you know I'm lying? He said out loud. Shut up, Busker, Talbot said. Make up your mind. Do you want me to shut up, or do you want me to talk? Brienne said, then immediately regretted it when Talbot backhanded him across the face. Sasha! Shadow shook his head, frowning at her. Talbot hung her head. I'm sorry, she mumbled, staring at her boots. I shouldn't have done that. He just gets to me, you know. Brienne could feel the blood trickling down from his cut lip. The leaf is making you reckless, he thought. You can't afford that now. He was beginning to wish the mage's truth spell would work. That way he'd be believed. But maybe connection and persuasion was a two-way street. On impulse, he leaned forward, looked into Finn's eyes, and attempted to catch the thread of his music. Even if he couldn't give it back to him, he'd have more information than he did before. But Finn's eyes were like iced-over pools that he couldn't penetrate. Brienne could hear no song at all. Was it because Finn was a wizard? Had he ever tried to charm a wizard before? Maybe not. That was when Brienne's chair burst into flame. Brienne screamed, twisting and turning, unable to get free. Quick as thought, Talbot snatched the quilt from Brienne's bed and tried to smother the flames with it, but the chair kept burning. Finally, Talbot cut through his bonds with her knife and freed him from it. Then Finn put it out with some kind of charm. What was that all about? Finn demanded, kicking at the heap of charred wood. What purpose did that serve? If you were trying to kill yourself, there are easier ways. Me? Brienne gasped, tears leaking from his eyes. His arm was blistered from wrist to elbow. I don't know what the hell happened, but it wasn't me that did it. Do you think I'm stupid enough to set myself on fire? We have no idea how stupid you are, Finn said. Brienne didn't even try to respond. He was in a sea of agony that rolled over him in waves. Even adding up all the painful experiences he'd ever had, nothing compared with this. If he'd ever had any plans to set himself on fire, this experience had set him straight. Just kill me, he thought, or cut off my arm, which has to be less painful than what I'm feeling now. Finn looked up at Shadow and Talbot. Shall we continue with— No, Talbot said. This was so unexpected that everyone turned and gaped at her. Can't you see how much pain he's in? She said, looking stricken. We have to take care of his arm. Look, why don't I come back and try again on my own? Finn said, as soon as he's feeling better. Let's hold off for now, Shadow said. We've sent word to Captain Byrne and the Queen. I'm sure Princess Alyssa will want to question him herself. With his mind in a fog of pain, it took Brienne a moment to process what he'd just said. Wait, what? She's alive? Brienne looked from face to face, sure this was some kind of ruse or trick or ugly joke. The princess is alive? Aye, she is, Talbot said. Lucky for you. But 2 of her escorts was killed in the attack. That ought to be enough to hang you. From good Charlie to bad in a twinkling. But Brienne didn't care. He hardly noticed when the healer came in. Having that guilt over the girlie's murder lifted from his shoulders was almost worth the pain. 30. Good news and bad news. After the disaster of his interview with Captain Gray, Hal continued his tournaments, but once again restricted them to his own soldiers. Gray came and watched the workouts 2 days in a row. Hal assumed it was to make sure they weren't stockpiling weapons or planning an escape or playing with the other team. On the 3rd day, Gray called him in after the competitions were over and suggested that they organize a series of meets between volunteers from both the Highlanders and the Ardenine army. Hal tried to see a trap in that. Were they looking for a sporting way to finish them off? Food was in short supply, after all. It must be costing them to feed the remnants of his squadron. You're not worried that either side might forget that it's a game? He said. We'll still use rebated and wooden weapons, Gray said. I'm thinking we could field mixed teams, designated by color, so it's not Northerners fighting Southerners. We'll start with competitions that don't involve one-on-one fighting. No mages. She nodded readily. No mages. What about women? What about them? Would they be participating? If they volunteer, Gray said, lifting her chin, that familiar flame of warning lighting in her eyes. Why do you ask? I just wondered, Hal said, shifting from foot to foot. As long as your soldiers know the risks, and as long as they volunteer, I can't imagine there would be a problem, Gray said, stuffing her hands in her jacket pockets. From her expression, she'd scored a point on him, but it took Hal a moment to work it out. His upbringing had given him no skills to deal with this. Why are you doing this? He blurted. She looked at him as if it must be obvious. I'm impressed with your program, Captain. I'm hoping that we'll all learn something. Again, some of Hal's men were wary of the matchups after their previous experience, but others clearly looked forward to demonstrating their skill with martial arts. Generally speaking, the Northerners were not highly skilled in classical longsword fighting, of the sort Hal had been brought up on. That made sense, since they did most of their fighting from cover and from horseback, in a hit-and-run fashion. When they did fight with swords, the match was not always decided at the end of a blade. They cunningly combined grappling and footwork with swordplay, and could often gain the advantage over a stronger arm. That came to be called Northern rules in their bouts, and it leveled the field between men and women more than Hal had expected. Most men were stronger and taller, with a longer reach, but that didn't mean that they would win every single time. Hal had to admit that in a real battle situation, there were no rules. The clans did not deign to participate in most of the contests, since they used few of the weapons Hal's men employed. The exceptions were knife-throwing and wrestling, skills they excelled in. Time and again, Hal ended up pinned to the ground. Some of Hal's men grumbled at that, but the bouts were, after all, voluntary. One afternoon, Hal found himself facing off with Captain Gray at the longsword. He'd been matched with her twice before. He'd won both of those matches, but it hadn't been a walk in the park. She was tall and strong for a woman, and she had a long reach as well. And it seemed like she'd watched every one of his matches since. They came up face to face and bowed to each other, and Captain Gray said, "Northern rules?" which to Hal's mind meant no rules at all. "Northern rules," he said with a shrug. "Go to," the matchmaster said, and they went at it with a will. It seemed Gray had learned something from her study of his previous matches. Almost immediately she drove in close, so they were all but nose to nose. Hal couldn't recall fighting so close in before, where his size and reach did little good. Not only that, her scent filled his nose, a musky mix of sweat and sunlight on skin and lanolin. She thrust out a foot and tangled his ankles, and he went down hard on his back, the air exploding from his lungs. Laughter rained down on him from all sides, even from his own men. "Point to Captain Gray," the master bawled. She's been spending time with the demon eye, Hal thought crossly, as Gray extended a hand and helped him up. The next match ended about the same as that one, though it did take longer. "Match to Captain Gray!" the onlookers shouted in unison. There followed scattered howling. There was nothing witchy about her tactics. She used speed and agility and focus, just like any other soldier. But she wasn't like any other soldier. Not like any he'd encountered, anyhow. Despite the cold, she shed her jacket and rolled back her sleeves, revealing corded biceps gleaming with sweat and a puffy scar that ran the length of her left forearm. Her top two shirt buttons were undone, and Hal could see a pendant glittering at her neckline and a tattoo on her collarbone, a gray wolf. Don't get distracted, he thought. Focus. In the next match, she slipped past his sword and drove in low, plowing into his middle, but this time he grabbed onto her so they both went down, with Hal on top. He found himself pressed flat against her from chest to knees, their faces again just inches apart. Some devil spirit seized him, and it took everything that was in him not to finish their match with a kiss. He could guess how that would be received. Overhead he heard the boutmaster call, "Match to Captain Madelon!" But he scarcely noticed. Gray squirmed under him, trying to flip him off her, and to his mortification, his traitorous body reacted to this with great and obvious enthusiasm. Captain Gray noticed, of course. She didn't pretend not to, like any Southern lady would do. She didn't seem embarrassed at all. Instead, she lifted her head so her breath warmed his ear, and said, "Sword in your pocket, Captain?" Hal pitched himself to one side, landing face first in the snow, afraid to roll onto his back. Fortunately, the snow melting underneath him put an end to his dilemma rather quickly. When he thought it was safe to do so, he propped up on his hands and knees and looked up. Gray was grinning and extending a hand to help him up. He accepted, because it would have been childish not to, but when he was on his feet, he pulled free immediately. "No harm done," she said, looking highly amused. "Good match, Captain." She looked around. "It seems we have lost our audience." A commotion in the manor yard had drawn the attention of the match spectators, who had lined up along the wall and were gawking at a crowd of newcomers gathered in front of the door. Hal heard shouting and cheering and general merriment. Then the bells in the manor chapel began to ring, not the familiar measured cadence he associated with loss, but the pealing sound of good news. His present worries were replaced by new worries. Good news for the Fells was likely to be bad news for his homeland. When fireworks began going off, he was certain. Bad news or good news, Hal thought. It's all a matter of perspective. "Well," Gray said, "either somebody's got married, the Queen's delivered demon twins, or we've won the war." She seemed to be waiting for a reaction to this latest poke, but Hal declined to play. He'd had enough schooling for the day. "Which of those possibilities do you think is most likely, ma'am?" he said stiffly. Her smile faded. "Maybe we should go see what's happened." She picked up her jacket and shrugged into it, smoothing her hair with both hands. Madelon straightened his shirt, following with his uniform jacket. It was in bad shape, torn in places and stained with blood and dirt. He'd attempted to rinse out the stains, and he'd done his best to darn the rips with his careful stitches, but it wasn't much of an improvement. At home, he would have replaced it long ago. She studied him critically as they walked toward the crowd. "Your jacket looks like it's seen hard use. We could probably get you something else to wear." "This serves," he said gruffly. "It helps me remember who I am." In the entry of the manor house stood a slender, dark-haired woman dressed in traveling garb, wool trousers, a heavy wool coat, and boots. Next to her stood a tall, weathered blue jacket with an elaborate sword, and two other women. One wore a Highlander uniform. The other was Lady Barrett, who'd interviewed Hal several times since he'd been taken prisoner. She'd returned to the capital a week ago. Now she was back with some companions. Captain Gray seemed exceptionally glad to see them, because she'd charged forward, leaving Hal behind. Before she reached them, though, she seemed to remember herself, skidded to a halt and saluted, bringing her fist to her chest. "Your Majesty," she said to the woman in traveling garb, "welcome to Delphi." "Thank you, Captain Gray," the newcomer said with a warm smile. "Your Majesty." Hal stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the bloodthirsty, demon-riding witch he'd heard about all his life. His first thought was that she looked thin and weary, and yet bursting with good news. "General Dunedain," Gray said, saluting the other woman, who answered in kind. Now Hal was close enough to see that the woman wore a green officer's scarf,
A general's scarf it must be. "Welcome back, Juliana," Gray said to Lady Barrett. "I'm so glad to see you, all of you. Why didn't anyone tell me you were coming?" "I didn't know myself until day before yesterday," the Queen said. "That's when I heard some good news, Captain, that I just had to share in person." "Arden surrendered?" Gray guessed. "Almost as good," the Queen said. "The monster is dead." Gray frowned, looking puzzled. "The monster?" "Gerard Montaigne. We just received word from our agents in the south. He's dead." Gray took a step forward, staring at the Queen, her face alight with mingled joy and disbelief. "Dead?" she whispered, as if this news was a bright, shiny package she was afraid to open. "Dead?" The word echoed in Hal's head. King Gerard is dead? What would that mean for his family? Might it mean that he could finally go home? Well, he looked around the headquarters, at the Bluejackets and Highlanders all around him. There were definitely some obstacles in his way. "We don't know exactly how and when it happened," the Queen was saying. "We surmise that it was just after solstice. It seems that there was some kind of attack on the palace at Ardencourt, an attack that is being blamed on me." She shrugged as if wearing that blame wasn't too burdensome. "Something smashed the palace tower to bits," Lady Barrett said. "They're claiming it was a demon, this magical creature that nobody can find now." She rolled her eyes. "Every time the Southerners lose, they blame it on demons. Supposedly, Montaigne wasn't killed in the attack, but was so despondent afterward that he threw himself from the tower." She shook her head. "I haven't found a single person who believes that. Whenever Montaigne got a little down, he just murdered a few people, and that set him to rights." That much is true, Hal thought. But if there was an attack, who else was hurt? It was the winter season, after all, when his family was likely to be at court. He edged forward, unable to contain himself. "Was anyone else killed or injured?" They all turned round and looked at him. "Have we been introduced?" the Queen said, cocking her head, fixing him with green eyes that seemed to look right through him. Gray jumped in to explain. "Your Majesty, this is Captain Halston Matalon, the former commander of the Ardenine forces here in Delphi. Captain Matalon, meet Queen Reza Anna Mariana." "Captain Matalon," Queen Reza said. "I met your father once or twice when I was a little girl. An impressive man, and far too good a soldier to be fighting on the wrong side. I've heard that you are highly capable on the battlefield as well." "Thank you, ma'am," Hal said, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. "But if I were highly capable, I would not be standing here a captive. I would have won." "Don't be too hard on yourself, Captain," the Queen said. "Captain Gray is one of our most well-respected commanders." She winked at Gray, who looked as if the Queen had just handed her a bouquet. Queen Reza put her hand on Barrett's shoulder. "Lady Barrett may be able to answer your question about casualties. She's read all of the dispatches in full." Barrett nodded. "There were some casualties in the attack, but we don't have names. From all accounts, Queen Marina and the 2 children survived. Prince Jarrett has been crowned king." Hal had met Prince Jarrett a few times. He hadn't come away impressed, but it was hard to imagine that the prince could be worse than his father. The Queen kept studying Hal, as if working out what manner of a man he was. "Captain Matalon, Lady Barrett has heard other news that you, in particular, should know," she said. Barrett took a second look at the Queen, as if to verify that she really wanted her sharing anything with Hal. Then she shrugged and said, "Apparently there's been considerable grumbling among the Thanes following the loss of Delphi. Some have refused to offer more men and more money to the war effort." "I see," Hal said, in what he hoped was a neutral way. This was nothing new. He recalled his conversation with his father just after his reassignment to Delphi. Lord Madelon had blamed it on his own outspoken criticism of the war. The Madelons had long resisted funding King Gerard's obsession with the frozen north. Now I'm told that several of the most powerful Thanes, including your father, have publicly broken with the king over the issue. Before the king died, of course.
Hal straightened, his stomach churning. After 25 years, was the Civil War starting up again? Could the rebellious Thanes be responsible for the king's death? Civilian casualties had been catastrophic when Gerard was battling his brothers for the throne. A civil war has no winners, only losers, and is to be avoided at all costs. That was another truth that had been drilled into him since he was small. If that is true, I'm sorry that my failure played a part in that.
Think of it not as your failure, but our success, Grey said, drawing a grin from Dunedain. In response, Montaigne imprisoned the families of the members of the Thane Council, including your mother and sister. Apparently, he intended to keep them as hostages against the Thanes' good behavior. This was going from bad to worse. His father had warned him to stay out of the king's jail at all costs. Now Harper and their lady mother had taken his place. Harper had inherited their father's temper and stubborn streak. Who knew how she would respond in this situation? He cleared his throat. That's difficult to believe, he lied. The king must have known that my father would never surrender to pressure of that kind. Keep in mind that I have no way to verify that story, Barrett said. I'm told that the king's behavior was erratic prior to his death. Thanely Matalon and her daughter have not been seen since Delphi fell, but they may be in hiding for safety's sake. However, I do have it on good authority that your father has called in his banners. Hal felt pounded by bad news, outnumbered by his enemies, with no way to confirm or disprove what he'd been told. But he had to ask, Have you heard news of my brother Robert? We believe he's at White Oaks with your father, General Dunedain said. That, at least, was good news. White Oaks was the seat of the Madelon holdings, and its keep would be a formidable nut to crack. It may be that we're wrong about your family, Barrett said, or that, under a new king, a general pardon might be issued. I'm wondering if the death of your king might signal a new relationship between our realms, Captain, the Northern Queen said. What do you think? Forgive me, ma'am, Hal said, his mind swimming with worry. I'm not much for politics. Spoken like a true soldier, the Queen said, glancing at Grey. Still, I look forward to hearing your opinions. Something's going on, Hal thought, looking from Barrett to the Queen. Something I don't know about yet that's caused them to allow me to listen in while they discuss developments in Arden. How much of what they've told me is true? What is it they are wanting me to do? Now, apparently, that had ended, because Captain Byrne motioned to his bluejackets. We're going to spend some time briefing Captain Grey on recent developments. Escort Captain Matalon back to his quarters. 31. Bad news and good news. When Matalon had gone, Lys led the way to the privacy of the library. Once they were there, her mother opened her arms, and Lys flew into them, all but lifting her mother from the floor in a savage dance of victory. We will raise another mountain, and we'll build it with your bones. I only wish I could have killed the bastard myself, Lys said, but I'll take it just the same. She poured steaming mugs of wassail for everyone, and they took seats around the hearth. Ah, sweetheart, her mother murmured, I have waited so very long for this day. I just wish that we could all be together, so we could celebrate properly. Lys knew she was thinking of her grandfather and her father, her sister and Adrian too. They're here in spirit, Mama, and soon Adrian will be here in the flesh. She paused, eager to share in the celebration at home, even if it was second-hand. Are the bonfires burning in the spirits? They are, her mother said, smiling. She looked around. You've made yourself at home here, I see. We have more good news, Your Highness, Captain Byrne said. We believe we have captured the busker that lured you into that ambush. That drove everything else from Lys's mind. Really? Are you sure it's him? Byrne nodded. He was carrying the ruins of that instrument you drew for us. He claims to be a traveling musician. He admits he was hired to play for you, but denies any knowledge of what they were planning to do. What's his name? Lys asked. He says it's Brion de Tarvos, Byrne said. Where's Tarvos? It's a port in Carthus, Byrne said. I don't know anyone who's ever been there, but it's supposed to be a nest of pirates. He claims he isn't magical, but he has some kind of strange emblem on the back of his neck. Lys couldn't help fingering the back of her own neck. Emblem? It's raised, metallic, but embedded in the skin and impossible to remove, Byrne said. It resembles white gold or platinum with a faceted blue stone. Shadow wasn't familiar with it, and he's knowledgeable about flashcraft and magic. Finn doesn't know what to make of it either. Maybe it's some kind of pirate badge. Or maybe Arden is controlling its mages with embedded amulets instead of collars, Lys said. There's one more thing, Juliana said. A year or so ago, we received a message from Carthus, from someone who called herself the Empress in the East. She was offering a reward for anyone with a badge or brooch embedded in their skin. The message came via a pirate, and we'd never heard of this Empress, and we'd never seen anything like that anyway, so we pretty much ignored it. Now I'm thinking we should try to get in touch with this Empress and see what she can tell us. Lys nodded. Was the busker taken in Fellsmarch, or— Byrne shook his head. No, he was captured in Chalk Cliffs, and he's being kept in the guardhouse there. It seems that he intended to take ship for Arden, which counts against him. Shadow and Talbot and Sulmander have been interrogating him, but he's sticking with his story. I want to go to Chalk Cliffs and talk to him, Lys said, remembering the boy with the haunting eyes and the ethereal music. I might catch him in a lie, or persuade him to confess. Besides, I need to find out what it was about him that turned me into a fool, and cost 2 good wolves their lives. Her mother nodded, as if she'd expected that. I agree. I don't blame you for wanting to unearth the whole story, although I have hopes that, with Montaigne dead, his grudge died with him. Perhaps we've seen the end of these murders. Lys's breath caught. That hadn't even occurred to her. Was it possible? Did this mean that she would no longer have to worry every time her mother walked out the door? Could Lys really walk the streets of the capital without listening for the sound of crossbows? I want you to take a squadron of Highlanders with you, the Queen said. Captain Byrne will send 2 triples of wolves along. I want some strength in numbers, especially if they might be bringing the boy back to Fellsmarch. I don't want this fish slipping through our fingers. It would be good to get out of Delphi, briefly anyway, and see Sasha and Shadow and Finn again. I'm curious about Captain Matalon. General Dunedain turned her cup between her hands. He has an excellent reputation as a field commander, and yet you've defeated him on the battlefield twice in a row. Now that he's been your prisoner for several weeks, what do you think of him? Matalon? Lys considered this. He is a soldier's officer. His men are intensely loyal, with good reason. As far as our face-offs, you already know that Matalon was dealt a very bad hand at Queen Court. Interesting that Khan would put an officer like Matalon in that position, Juliana said. Has he said anything about that? Complained about it? Lys shook her head. As you might have noticed, he's very close-mouthed when it comes to offering opinions. He doesn't trust us. I would be surprised if he trusts anyone after being raised in Arden, Raisa said. What about here in Delphi? Dunedain persisted. How did he fare here? Here at Delphi, Matalon made mistakes, Liz said. He allowed himself to be drawn into a battle on our field, on our terms. He was outsmarted. It happens. Liz paused. Since we're on the topic of Matalon, what was that show in the yard all about? Show? Juliana raised an eyebrow. I had the feeling that you were playing him, Liz said. That there was a purpose to spilling all that. There was, Juliana said, looking over the rim of her mug at Liz. What Juliana means is that we're still trying to figure out whether Montaigne's death is bad news or good news for us, her mother said. How could it possibly be bad news? Liz stared at her mother in astonishment. I mean, you already said. We don't know much about the prince, Juliana said. Up to now, Gerard's been making all the decisions. As his brothers found out, relatives who didn't go along with Gerard's agenda paid a blood price. Now, King Jarrett will be in a position to make policy. Being 16, he's hard to predict. Queen Marina is regent, but she's never had much agency as far as we can tell. Maybe, the Queen murmured, looking unconvinced. She is a Tomlin, after all. She might surprise you. Before Gerard's death, there was chatter about some mysterious new ally who would help Arden win the war once and for all, Juliana said. We don't know if Gerard was blowing smoke or if the deal is still on the table. Meanwhile, the Thanes will likely see this as an opportunity to regain some of the power they lost under King Gerard. He'd been systematically stripping them of lands and incomes since he ascended the throne, and any one of them, Matalon Sr., for instance, might decide he'd like to be king himself. Sounds like a political mess, Liz muttered. It is, Juliana said with a kind of peculiar delight. Unlike Liz, she seemed to thrive on political messes. We can sit up here and watch, or we can try to shape things to our advantage. How would we do that? Liz said, intrigued in spite of herself. There are several possibilities, her mother said. If the civil war continues, we'll back the side that wants to make peace with us. The Thanes are likely to want peace, Juliana said, because they've been the ones paying for the war in men and treasure. They've been complaining about it for years. That was at the root of the falling out between Thane Matalon and Gerard. If the Thanes want peace and King Jarrett wants war, Lys's mother said, then we strike an agreement with the Thanes, and we send Captain Matalon back to fight alongside his father. What are the other possibilities? Liz said warily. It may be that King Jarrett and the Thanes will reconcile immediately, now that Gerard is out of the way, Juliana said. If that happens, the question is, will they want to continue this war or sue for peace? In other words, was this damnable war really all about King Gerard's hurt feelings, or is there more support for the war than we think? Liz said. All around, heads nodded. The Church of Malthus might favor carrying on with the war, since they've sold it as a battle between good and evil, Juliana said. But they have a history of standing down when confronted with the power of kings and princes. If they choose peace, then prisoners will be repatriated, the Queen said. Matalon goes home. Juliana and the Queen must have worked all this out between them before they came, Liz thought, with a flicker of irritation. Juliana was good at this. She was so damned good at it. And yet... And if it's war? If everyone's in the war party, then we don't want to send young Matalon back to them, the Queen said. Not only is he a capable military strategist and commander, but we would lose whatever leverage he gives us. You heard what he said about his father, Liz said, that he wouldn't... I know what he said. From what I know of Matalon Sr., the captain may be right. But sometimes, when the money's on the table, we make a different choice. When the money's on the table? What the hell did that mean? Lys's temper flared. What happens if they refuse to deal? She said. Do we cut off his head and send it to his father in a box? This was met with shocked silence. No, Alyssa, we do not, her mother said, her voice thick with disapproval. Nor do we throw him into a dungeon. You should know better than that. He'll be kept in comfortable quarters suitable to his rank. He is a prisoner of war, after all. What if he doesn't go along with your plan? Lys said, looking from Juliana to her mother. What if he tries to escape? She gestured at their surroundings. This was never intended to be a prison. It's right on the border, and it's not very secure. We know that, her mother said. That is why we're going to move him to a more secure location. She paused. I want you to take him with you to Chalk Cliffs. Lys's mind was already racing, divided between travel plans and the tactical conversation. Now it screeched to a halt. Madelon? Why would I take him along? I'd like to get him out of Delphi and into the fells. As you pointed out, this location is not at all that secure. There's a keep at Chalk Cliffs that's suitable. So I shot my own self in the foot, Lys thought. She didn't like any plan that used Madelon as a game piece, and now she would be helping to move it forward. Plus, the last thing she needed was to babysit a prisoner all the way to the coast. Let Juliana escort Madelon to prison if she's so keen on the plan. That's not a good idea, Lys said, after discarding, that's a terrible idea, and that's a stupid idea. Why not? He'll try to escape the first chance he gets, and that's going to be even harder to prevent while we're traveling. He's going to be hot to get back to Arden and see what's what with his family. Her mother rubbed the back of her neck. We can hardly blame him for that. If he tries to escape, do we shoot him? Lys's voice was rising, and both her cousin and her mother were staring at her as if baffled. You must make sure that doesn't happen, the Queen said. Lys was a little baffled herself. Why was she standing up so strongly for Madelon? What exactly did she want done with him? Did she have a sense of ownership because she had been the one to spare his life in the first place? Does it mean that you're actually growing fond of him? No, you're just trying to make sure he gets a fair deal. Lys disliked the whole notion of interfering in Arden's affairs, or using Madelon to gather information or make their case. It smacked too much of Southern tactics in the past. What makes us different from them? The Queen leaned forward. Try to win him over, Alyssa. It seems to me that you have a lot in common. I'm hoping that once he understands that we're not all witches and demons, he'll be an ambassador for us once he goes home. If he goes home, Lys said. If you're going to take him hostage, it seems to me that it would be better to take him back to Fellsmarch, where there's a stronger keep. If we make a deal with the Thanes, it will be easier to send him back to his father by ship, Juliana said. It's too risky to send him overland through Arden. Madelon's a soldier, Lys thought. A good soldier. He's done nothing wrong. Leave him be. I know this doesn't sit well with you, Alyssa, the Queen said, twisting her wolf ring. But the stakes are very high. This is war, and we have to fight it on every battlefield. As you know, we've been struggling. Your capture of Delphi and Montaigne's death are the first bits of good news we've had in a long time. If we play our cards right in Arden, we could end this bloody war and have an ally to the south for the first time in my lifetime. We might even regain some influence over the other realms. If we back the losing horse, we could be paying for it for years. She paused, and when Lys said nothing, added, This is not a negotiation. These are my terms. Otherwise you can stay here or return to Fellsmarch with me. If those are my choices, then I accept your terms, Lys said, looking her in the eye. Good. Now, the Queen said, raising her glass, I would like to raise a toast to the brightest winter solstice in a very long time. The sun has come again, thank the Maker. It may be that our solstice curse has finally broken." They all drank deeply, and Byrne poured more. But Liz couldn't help worrying that the fates were listening and making their own plans. 32. On the road to Chalk Cliffs. Just a day after the Queen of the Fells arrived, Hal was playing Nix and Bones by the fire with Bernard and Littlefield. They'd set up a regular game in the afternoons when the weather was bad, which was nearly all the time. Bernard was one of the survivors of the Ardenine garrison. Littlefield commanded one of the Felsian squadrons and reported directly to Captain Gray. Others sat in as they came available. Hal had made a point of getting to know as many Northerners as possible. He reasoned that he could use all the friends he could get. Captain Gray appeared at the guardhouse door, wearing a scowl. "Madelon, pack your things and be ready to ride out early in the morning." There wouldn't be much packing up to do. All he had was the clothes on his back, his cold weather gear, and 2 changes of small clothes. "Where am I going?" he asked. "You'll find out." When Gray went to turn away, Madelon said, "Ma'am." When she turned back, he said, "Shall I tell my men to get ready as well?" "No," she said, "just you." And she was gone. Hal turned back to his companions. "Does either of you know what this is about?" He was mainly directing this at Littlefield, who was, after all, Captain Gray's direct report. Littlefield shook his head. "I'll see what I can find out." That evening, Littlefield found Hal in the practice yard. "It's all hush-hush, but I heard that one of Captain Barnes's squadrons is riding out tomorrow, too." He shrugged. "I couldn't see the harm in telling you that much." Was this good news or bad news? "Thank you, Littlefield," he said lightly. "I appreciate it, and if I never see you again, I forgive you the 5 crowns you owe me." "And I'll forget the 17 crowns you owe me," Littlefield said. Growing serious, he clasped Hal's hand. "Good luck to you, Madelon." After Littlefield left, Hal leaned against the palisade, thinking. He didn't like the idea of being separated from what remained of his command. It wasn't that he had illusions that he could protect them against whatever harm might come their way, but at least he would have been there as their advocate. It was one of the reasons he'd stalled on planning an escape from the compound, and now it might be too late. Whatever the plan was, Captain Gray didn't seem happy with it. What did that mean? Did it mean that the Queen and her party would be escorting him back to Fellsmarch for safekeeping? Would Captain Gray be riding along? He found himself hoping that she would be. In the time they'd spent together, he'd become convinced that she was not a witch, only a soldier like himself. They'd come to an understanding, a relationship of mutual respect. He'd learned a lot and had realized that she had a lot more to teach him. He hoped that she was learning something too. She fascinated him, challenged him, sometimes enraged him, but she was never boring. "Don't lose your head, Madelon. Don't let it distract you from your mission." It didn't matter where they were taking him. He had his own plans. It turned out that Captain Gray was in the party that left the Delphian Army headquarters before dawn the next morning. To Hal's dismay, Lieutenant Bosley was too. It seemed that he was the commander of the squadron of Highlanders Littlefield had mentioned. There was also a swarm of bluejackets who seemed to be assigned to watch over Hal. He saw their colors peeking out from under their white woolen cloaks. Hal's mount was one of the shaggy mountain ponies his captors favored, which was just one more sign they were heading north. He was grateful for the thick wool cloak, tent, and bedroll the quartermaster gave him. Those would be helpful when he struck out on his own. He was less grateful for the shackles Bosley brought. "What's this?" Hal said, eyeing them unhappily. That would complicate things. "Captain's orders," Bosley said with a smirk. "Give me your wrists, Flatlander." Hal thrust them toward Bosley. "Do you really think I'm stupid enough to try to escape into the mountains in the winter?" "Doesn't matter what I think," Bosley said. "It's what Captain Gray thinks that matters." Bosley always said Captain Gray, like it was some kind of secret joke. What the hell, Hal thought. Does he think it's amusing to be using such a formal term for his lover? I wonder what he calls her when they're alone. Not your business, Madelon. At least the little pony was easy for Hal to mount, even with his hands bound, but he felt a little foolish sitting atop her. As Hal had expected, they put their backs to Arden and rode into the mountains. After studying the map he'd taken from a drawer in the duty room, he'd guessed they might take the main road north through 2 clan camps to the capital of Fellsmarch. Instead, they took a path that was little more than a hunting trail that seemed to be heading north and east. In places, the snow was drifted so high that a horse and rider might completely disappear if he made a misstep. Vast portions of the country they were traveling into appeared completely empty of roads or trails. He was beginning to question his ability to find his way back. If he planned to escape, it made sense to do it sooner rather than later, so there would be less chance of getting lost and less distance to cover on his way back south.
As they climbed, Hal began to appreciate the merits of these shaggy, stocky ponies. They were strong and sure-footed, with no delicate long legs to slide and break in this icy terrain. They had incredible stamina, seeming unfazed by a day-long uphill climb. Maybe he should introduce a breeding line of ponies into the Empire horse lines, though it would be a job to persuade any of his fellow officers to climb aboard one. He'd hoped to talk to Gray during the day and see if he could tease more information out of her, but he never had the chance. The trail was so narrow that there was little movement up and down the line. He was surrounded by bluejackets, while she must have been riding in the rear with the Highlanders, with Bosley. He tried to put that thought from his mind, but it remained there, like a burr in his boot. They stopped for the night on the lee side of a massive rock formation that provided some shelter from the wind. Once Hal had dismounted, Bosley came and removed the chains from his hands so he could tend to his horse. "Best behave," the lieutenant said, resting his hand on the pommel of his sword and smirking at him. He's hoping I make a break for it, Hal thought, which means I need to get away clean. His blue-jacket nannies chose his campsite for him, well within the perimeter, then set up their tents all around him. Hal methodically pitched his tent and arranged his bedroll to his liking. He saw Bosley pitching a large, rather more elaborate tent nearby. Was it Captain Gray's? And a smaller, plainer one next to it. To Hal's disappointment, his escorts picketed all of the horses together and set a guard on them. Hal took his supper of hard bread and cheese, surrounded by bluejackets, none of whom he'd met before. When he tried to start a conversation, they had little to say. The Witch Queen was taking no chances that her prize would slip away. The Highlanders were bunched around several other campfires, and Gray was with them. He could hear them talking and laughing and showing off the way men, and women, apparently, will do around the fire. Now and then he heard Bosley's voice above the rest. That did not improve his mood. It was almost as if Gray was avoiding him. "What's wrong with me?" Hal thought crossly. "I'm the prisoner of the Upland Queen. Gray has no reason to avoid me, or spend time with me, or think about me at all." He couldn't help himself. She was unlike any woman he'd met before. Granted, he'd never spent much time with women other than family, because he'd been a soldier in his father's command since he was 11 years old, and, as the captain relentlessly pointed out, there were no women in the Ardenine army. During the winter social season, he dutifully attended the parties he was invited to, and danced with the girls who were matched up with him, and kissed the ones who were willing. He enjoyed dancing and kissing well enough, but when it came to talking to them, he had little to say. They were not interested in the same things as he was, and he'd find himself fleeing to the billiards room or the cards room as soon as politeness would allow, just like his father before him. He'd never worried about wooing, because he knew he'd have little to say in a final match anyway. That would be dictated by family and politics and dowries and holdings. When it happened, he would make it work. Even if the job you're assigned is not to your liking, a Matalon will see it done. Gray was different. She was interested in all of the same things as he was, even though they agreed on practically nothing. She would debate any point into the dust, allowing no compromise, not even an agreement to disagree. Truth be told, he'd rather argue with Gray than make small talk with anyone else. Was he drawn to her because she was more like a man than other women he'd known? Was it because he was more comfortable with his own kind? No, she made him uncomfortable in all kinds of ways. Hal crawled into his tent, weighed down by the realization that he wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight, anyway. Sometime during the night, he awoke to loud voices nearby, some kind of an argument. Lifting his tent flap, he peered out and saw that it was Gray and Bosley, standing in front of the 2 tents Bosley had pitched earlier. Gray was in Bosley's face, flinging her hands around in that way she had. Bosley had both hands up as if to ward her off, and he was talking fast and persuasively. The next thing Hal knew, Gray was waving a dagger under Bosley's nose. With that, she turned and crawled into the smaller tent. Bosley stood glaring at the tent, hands fisted. After taking a quick look around, he crawled into the larger tent. Lovers' quarrel? It's not your business, Matalon. Still, he went to sleep, smiling.
33. In the Ruins. 2 days later, they were still traveling northeast, and Hal still hadn't made his move. When the weather was clear enough, he could see the massive peak of the Harlot to his right, so he knew they had traveled quite a distance to the east. Toward midday, they entered a broad, flat valley, and he realized they were at the western end of Queen Court, the scene of his late summer humiliation at the hands of Captain Gray. Look on the bright side, Halston. At least this way he would get to see the veil that had been his target. He'd never made it that far on his earlier visit. Though they were walled in by mountains and the fields were snow-covered, the fertile valley reminded Hal of home, with its farmsteads and hedgerows. Here and there, plumes of steam signaled where the hot blood of the uplands broke through a thin skin of rock and soil. This is what we were supposed to burn and destroy, had we made it through the pass, he thought. Now I'm just as glad we didn't. Unfortunately, he was seeing a lot more of Bosley than he was of Captain Gray. Each day before they mounted up, Bosley shackled his hands, taking his time, enjoying the moment. Each night, when they stopped, Bosley removed the bonds, taunting him, daring him to try to escape. Hal envisioned himself wrapping the chain around Bosley's neck until his smirk disappeared, and then escaping. What could Captain Gray possibly see in him? Bosley's speech and attitude said that he was high-born, but Gray didn't strike him as a soldier of fortune, someone who would marry for money. How do you know that? What do you really know about her anyway? Where was she born? Did she always know she wanted to be a soldier? What did she like to do when she wasn't in the field? Does she share your aversion to smoked snails? It's not your business, Matalon. That was becoming his new motto. He needed to leave, and leave soon. They camped for the night beside the remains of the Queen Court Keep. Hal had always been fascinated by castle architecture as it related to defense and offense. Before the winter dark came down, he walked around the outer perimeter, assessing strengths and weaknesses. His guard didn't even bother to follow him. Without a horse, he wouldn't get far with mountains all around. This keep lacked the thick stone skin Hal associated with northern castles. Even when newly built, this would not have been hard to crack. Now, if he occupied this keep, how would he go about defending it? Hal honored the crumbling wall by entering through the ruins of the old gate instead of climbing up and over. There wasn't much left of the buildings inside the wall either. It appeared that the original structure was built largely of wood, and centuries of punishing weather had returned it to the earth. All in all, to call it a keep was being generous. This reminded him more of manors and hunting lodges in the gentle south of Arden, built for beauty, not for strength. Hal stood, hands on hips, studying on it. The best way to defend this place was to prevent the enemy from reaching the walls in the first place. He'd clear away the trees that had crept in all around, then position bowmen at the corners with— "I'd dig a moat," somebody said, "and fill it with water gators." Hal spun around, groping for a sword that wasn't there. It was Gray. She was perched in a niche in the wall, one knee bent, the other leg extended, a sketch-pad on her lap. "That would be a start," he said, "but it wouldn't keep them out for long." "At least I'd get to see some of them eaten," Gray said, displaying her fierce smile. "It puzzles me," Hal said, picking up a loose stone and tossing it over the truncated wall. "How did they ever expect to defend it?" "It never had to be defended. This is a relic from a different time. It was once the council house for representatives from all of the 7 realms. The Grey Wolf Queen convened them here once a year, at the summer solstice. The entire vale would be carpeted in pavilions flying banners from the different realms. It was like a massive fair, with people wearing their ceremonial garb. They held tournaments." Her voice trailed off. "I've never heard about that, ma'am," Hal said honestly. It was difficult to imagine a time when Arden and the Fells had a shared history. That must have been a long time ago. It was. Before the Wizard Wars, before the Breaking, before the new line of queens. I'm sure the scholars in the Empire like to downplay that history. I'll wager that Gerard knew about it, though. That's why he sent you here this summer to destroy it." Running her hand over the stones, she said wistfully, "According to the old manuscripts, the interior was like a woodland cathedral. At midsummer, the sun never quite dipped below the horizon, so they would dance all night in the twilight." "You know your history," Hal said. "The upland clans say that it's important to remember the old stories," Gray said. "As soon as you forget a story, it comes around again, and you have to relive it." Gray was obviously proud of her homeland's past glory. Hal found himself feeling a bit guilty about Arden's role in its decline. Empires come and go, he thought. Dynasties rise and fall. It's the way the world is made. It's nobody's fault. His father had said that the never-ending war against the North was rooted in King Gerard's personal grudge against the Witch Queen. Captain Gray claimed it was because Queen Raisa had spurned Gerard's offer of marriage. It's not worth it, he thought. From what he'd seen, there was nothing up here to justify the spending of more lives and treasure. We should leave the North alone and consolidate and manage the territory we have. Let the Thanes tend their farms and rebuild their livelihoods. If we re-established trade with the North, everyone would prosper, North and South. He hoped this change of heart wasn't a result of the fact that he was falling hard for his jailer. He tried to tell himself that it was simply a recognition of her natural talent for command. She clearly had the respect of her soldiers and made sure they were taken care of. Even better, she seemed to have even less interest in politics and social niceties than he did. He loved the way she gave no quarter in the practice yard, fighting each match with grim determination, as if it were a life-and-death struggle. He loved the way she threw back her head and laughed until tears leaked from her eyes, the way she tracked down Bosley and confronted him when he treated her like something less than a real soldier. He loved those long legs and her tightly muscled, "No, she is an enemy soldier," he repeated to himself for the 1,000th time. He might be attracted to her, but she had no interest in him, except, perhaps, as a sparring partner. She was brusque, abrupt, openly hostile at times. They'd be having a conversation, and they'd seem to be getting on well, and then it was as if she suddenly remembered who he was, and that was the end of détente. Hal looked up, and Gray was looking down at him, her hands on her knees, studying him with the intensity she brought to every task. He realized he'd fallen silent for too long. "What are you drawing?" he said, eager to change the subject. He was always needing to change the subject with her. She held the sketch-pad out to him. He took it and studied what she'd drawn. It was clearly a rough sketch, but the structural detail was amazing. She'd rendered the ruins as they were, but she'd extended them with smoky lines to create a ghostly image of the building as it had once been. "You are... I had no idea you were an artist," Hal said. "You don't have to sound so surprised, Captain," she said. "Anyway, how would you know? I don't have much time for art these days. I think my legacy will be written in blood, not in oils and watercolors." "This war won't last forever," Hal said. "The question is whether I'll survive the peace." She slid a look at him. "Maybe the key is to live in the moment. It's not like we can control the future anyway." A year ago, he might have disagreed. He'd been raised to believe that if a man worked hard, played by the rules, and kept his word, he could make a good life for himself. It was that kind of thinking that had brought him here. Arden always needs capable officers, he thought. They recruited talent from every subject realm. Gray was clearly devoted to her homeland, but she seemed like a practical sort. Maybe he could put in a word once the war was over and find her a command somewhere, maybe in the down realms. Gray began gathering up her drawing supplies and sliding them into her carry-bag. "You sure spend a lot of time thinking, Captain Matalon," she said. "That's unusual in a southerner." "Don't quit working," Hal said. "I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'll go and leave you to it." "It's getting too dark to see now anyway." Gray leapt nimbly down from her seat on the wall, setting her carry-bag at her feet. She leaned against the wall next to him, her shoulder just touching his, seeming in no hurry to go back. As the wind sent eddies of snow swirling from the tops of the walls, Hal was suddenly aware of how alone they were, in the ruins of the old council house at the dying of the day. Although he could still hear the faint sounds of voices from the campsite, it felt like a million miles away. He wavered, pondering what to do. The truth was, he wanted to kiss this northern girl and go on from there. He wanted her more than any woman he'd ever known. It had started back in Delphi, and it had only gotten worse. At the same time, every element of his upbringing, every rational bone in his body said that it would be a big mistake, probably the mistake of a lifetime. This wasn't like him. It wasn't like him at all. Maybe it was the mountain air, or the witchery all around him. But he needed to leave this place before he did or said something dishonorable, or unforgivable, or suicidal. He couldn't say why Captain Gray got under his skin the way she did. Though strong and well-made, she was no great beauty compared to the women he'd been introduced to at court. Yet, when they were together, she elbowed everything else out of his mind. "Matalon?" He looked up, and she was studying him with her amber eyes. Did she know that she had this effect on him? He prayed to all the gods she did not. "Would you like to kiss me?" This came as such a surprise, more of an ambush, really, that it took a while for Hal to organize a response. It didn't help that the blood had deserted his brain and redeployed to other regions. Was this a trick question? The best response he could manage was a hoarse, "Why do you ask?" She huffed her breath out. "Because you keep staring at my lips." Hal's cheeks burned. "Oh, I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I—" "Was I mistaken, then?" Hal opened his mouth to lie, and then stopped and shook his head. "No, you're not mistaken." "Oh." Other girls he'd known might blush and flutter, but not Gray. He waited for her to punch him instead, or laugh, or tell him how stupid and arrogant he was. Instead, she said, "Well then, go ahead. I don't mind." "You don't mind?" This was totally outside Hal's admittedly limited wooing experience. "No, I don't mind," she said with a shrug. "Oh, well, do you want to?" "Forget it," she growled, spots of pink coloring her cheeks. "Let's walk back. I've spent less time dickering over a horse." Hal's father always said that a good soldier adapts to a changing battlefield. "Wait." When she turned back, he cradled her chin with his gloved hands and kissed her. Her lips were warm and rough and perfect. Encouraged, he slid his arms around her and pulled her close, extending the kiss. They were of nearly equal height, and they fit together like the two halves of something fine. Even through several thick layers of clothing, he noticed the way her breasts pressed into him. He'd thought she was all muscle, and the tidy way she curved down to her waist. She smelled like fresh air and sweat, metal and horse. Perfect. When they finally broke apart, she studied him a moment, then took his face between her warm hands and kissed him again, long and deep, their hearts thumping between them. With a kind of growl, Hal pinned her to the wall and answered her with a longer, deeper kiss of his own. And then it was like a kind of madness took them, a frenzy of kissing, a sudden frustration with the layers of cold-weather clothes that separated them. Hal wasn't a total novice, but he wasn't a deft hand at this either. He should have made a better job of it, since she wore men's clothes after all. Finally, he yanked her shirt free of her breeches and thrust his hands underneath. His hands were rough with calluses, and they must have been cold, but she didn't seem to mind. Instead, she slid down the wall, pulling him down with her, then rolled on top so she sat astride him, pawing at his clothing, fumbling with his shirt buttons, trying to find a way in. When she ripped his shirt open, he heard buttons plopping into the snow all around them. And then she was kissing and nipping at every bit of bare flesh she could get at. Though still fully clothed, they were somehow belly to belly, skin to skin. He was beginning to regret not being the sort of man who carried a sheath around. Besides, how could he possibly go about asking whether she might be willing to—
"Captain Gray!"
someone shouted, frighteningly near at hand.
"Where are you?" "Madelon!"
somebody else shouted.
They sprang apart like bolts shot from a bow. Gray's cheeks were flushed, and her braid was all but pulled apart. There followed a frenzy of buttoning and fastening and tying and tidying. Hal buttoned his coat over his buttonless shirt, just as a mob of bluejackets boiled around the corner of the gate, Bosley in the lead. "There you are!" Bosley's eyes swept the scene inside the perimeter. By now it was all but too dark to see, which was a blessing, since it made the spot where the snow was packed down less obvious. Hal planted his foot over two dark spots in the snow. Buttons. Bosley's glare fastened on Hal. "What are you two doing out here in the dark?" he demanded. He sounded more like somebody's enraged father than like a betrayed lover. Hal decided he'd better let Captain Gray answer that question. When he didn't respond, Bosley turned on Gray. "You shouldn't be out here alone with him. What's the matter with you? If the Queen were to see you like this, she—" With that, he stopped on his own, as if unable to find a path forward. Gray slowly turned her head, as if she couldn't believe her ears. "Are you addressing me, Lieutenant?" "Somebody needs to speak up for safety's sake," Bosley said, looking to the bluejackets for support and getting none. "And you're thinking that someone is you?" Captain Gray cocked her head, as if she was just now figuring that part out. "You are out of line, Lieutenant. How and where I choose to interrogate a prisoner of the Crown is none of your concern." Of all the terrifying stories Hal had heard about Northern torture tactics, this particular interrogation technique had never been mentioned. "You expect us to believe that you are interrogating him?" "I have absolutely no expectations of you, Bosley, except that you return to your tent and stay there. While there, I suggest that you study the officers' rules of good order. Pay special attention to the chapter on the chain of command." She waved her hand, dismissing him. Bosley stood frozen for a long moment, fists clenched, then got off a salute and stalked away. As he passed Hal, he delivered a look so venomous that Hal all but made the sign of Malthus. Bosley means to kill me before we get wherever we're going, Hal thought. I need to be gone before that happens.
34. At Cross Purposes. Liz crawled into her tent, her heart still pounding, the blood still raging through her veins. Her lips felt slightly bruised from kissing, her skin sanded and sensitive from Madelon's touch. Desire was still burning so hot inside her, it seemed she would never put it out. Should I go out and roll in the snow? Would that help? Her mind was a battleground of conflict, the memory of her guards' shocked and worried faces, embarrassment at being surprised like that, the eerie sense that she'd been possessed by the kind of romping jilt who would take advantage of a prisoner of war. She wanted to do things with Madelon that she'd never contemplated before. This was mingled with an intense desire to push Bosley over a cliff. When my mother told me to win Madelon over, this is probably not what she had in mind, Liz thought. But she'd given Liz an impossible task: keep the Thaneling prisoner, but make friends with him. What must Madelon be thinking? Did this confirm everything he'd heard about the women in the north? He'd seemed enthusiastic enough, but maybe he felt like he had to go along. Was he worried about what might happen next, or was he cynically looking forward to it? Her answer came 2 days later, when Madelon bolted. Liz had called a halt for the midday. Madelon went off for a piss and never came back. He'd staked his pony a short distance away, and so it was some time before he was missed. His hands were still shackled, but that didn't stop him. It took the best part of that day to track him down. He was smart. Instead of retracing their trail back south, he'd continued east, apparently planning to round Alyssa Peak and cross the plateau to Spirit Gate. He knew the territory, after all. He'd come that way in the fall with Karn's army. But one rider is easy to spot on the expanse of a snowy plain. When they ran him down, it took 4 soldiers to subdue him, and all parties ended up bruised and bloody. When he was finally pinned, Liz had to intervene personally to prevent Bosley from pounding him to a pulp. When the healers were done with him, Liz went to see him in the makeshift tent they'd put up for the purpose. He was sitting on a trunk, his manacled hands dangling between his knees. They'd stripped him to the waist so they could wrap his broken ribs and get at his many cuts and bruises. Around his neck, he wore a silver thimble on a chain, an odd ornament for a soldier. The muscles that layered his shoulders and arms were inscribed with the remnants of past battles, overlaid with the fresh wounds of today. Liz longed to trace that history with her fingers so she could read the man beneath. "Haven't you done enough damage?" Madelon looked up and caught her staring.
"My swordmaster used to say that the scars a man carries are the evidence that he let someone get too close."
"He was right," Liz said. "But that's how we fight in the north, in close." She paused, and when he didn't respond, said, "You shouldn't have run."
"You should have let me go."
He looked away. "I can't do that. The Queen forbade me to. The Queen made it clear how important it was to keep you from escaping."
What does your queen intend to do with me?"
"I don't think she knows. It depends on what happens between your father and the new king."
"So I'm to be imprisoned until that's sorted out? That could take years."
"This war won't last forever," she said, echoing Madelon's words in the ruins of the old castle. She paused, and then, in a rush, said, "Captain, I'm sorry about the other night." His eyes met hers, steady, honest eyes that made her feel worse than ever.
"I'm not."
"That should never have happened. It was wrong to put you in that position."
I rather liked that position while it lasted, he said, without a trace of a smile. If he'd smirked, she would have had to kill him. I didn't run because of what happened in the ruins. In fact, that was the one thing that might have persuaded me to stay. I should not have misled you about what can happen between us, Liz said, the words all but catching in her throat. Why was it so damned hard to do the right thing? Didn't you say that the key is to live in the moment? Madelon said. That's the excuse people use for foolish behavior. I am not a giddy person, Madelon said, and the whole notion was so ludicrous that Liz might have laughed if she hadn't had this big, aching hole inside. But I've never met anyone like you. We have so much in common, and yet you've made me question everything I thought I knew. He looked down at his hands. It's painful, but I want to keep on with it. I'm teachable, and I think we could be good together, in whatever way makes sense to you. Madelon was no poet either, but he got the job done. And yet you ran. Aye, he said. I ran. My family is in danger. My sister, she's just 13. If what your queen says is true, she's in the jail at Ardenscourt. I've seen it. His face was a mask of worry. Our lives are at cross purposes, Liz said. It's time we recognize that, but I hope that we can still be friends. For once, she took no joy in scoring a point on Madelon. Is this how you treat your friends in the north? This is war, Liz said. We are soldiers. I wish things could be different. She wondered if this new pain in her gut was her heart breaking. Madelon gripped both her hands. We are soldiers, he said. We are not game pieces on a board. Don't let them play us. Give this thing a chance. Liz gently pulled free. You're wrong, Captain, she said. We never had a chance. At the end of the day, that is all that we are, game pieces. If you don't know that by now, you soon will. The rest of the way to Chalk Cliffs, Liz put Madelon's pony on a lead line, where he could be towed along amid a group of wolves. Every night, she ordered Madelon shackled to a tree. She'd already decided there would be no more private conversations. She'd always been as easy to read as any book, and she didn't want to offer him any encouragement. Her life was complicated enough as it was. Then why did she feel this desperate sense of loss? She also ordered Bosley to have no direct contact with Madelon. He didn't take it well. What do you mean, no contact? I am the commander of this squadron, and as such, you report to me, Liz said. My only regret is that I didn't act on this sooner. Is this about when we had to subdue him? Did he lodge some kind of complaint against me? If so, I have eyes, Bosley. As a prisoner of the Crown, Captain Madelon is under the charge of the Queen's Grey Wolf Guard. I've already spoken with Corporal Greenholt and instructed her to that effect. But, further, if anything happens to my prisoner between here and Chalk Cliffs, if he falls off a cliff or dies in his sleep or mysteriously disappears, I'll see you brought up on charges. How do you expect me to? You're done, Lieutenant. Now go. All through the rest of the trip, Liz imagined that she felt the captain's eyes on her. But it was probably swiving Bosley. If he kept on the way he was going to end up falling off a cliff. Everything taken together, she was relieved to descend the long slope to the stark white cliffs of the northern coastline, and to see the angry grey Indio beyond. She looked forward to seeing Sasha again, someone she could actually talk to. The plan was to stash Madelon away in the keep and send word via Juliana's operatives in the south to see if contact could be established with the Thane, his father. Otherwise, they'd keep his presence quiet in order to prevent any possible attacks on the city in an effort to free him. That was diplomacy, a mixture of friendly faces and veiled threats. Lys had visited Chalk Cliff several times in the past. The town had once been a bustling, prosperous port, but it was hard to believe it now. Blockades by Ardenine warships and attacks by Carthian pirates had reduced commerce to a trickle. Warehouses stood empty, since little to nothing was coming in, and clan crafters and veil farmers were forced to find other routes for their trade goods. The high street was lined with taverns and bawdy houses, and little else. The keep was perched on a cliff-faced bluff that thrust out into the ocean. The waves crashing on three sides meant that Lys never slept well under that roof. But except for the fact that it was on the coast and so vulnerable to attack from the sea, it was as secure a place as any in the queendom. To meet the seaward threat, large cannon had been mounted on the cliff tops overlooking the harbor. Lys knew Madelon would try to escape again, the first chance he got. She didn't blame him, given the situation with his family, but she couldn't let that happen, not after she and her mother had argued over it. She didn't want to throw him in the dungeon either. When she explained the situation to the duty officer, he recommended that the Ardenine captain be quartered in a suite of rooms, isolated on the seaward side.
"If you don't want to put him in lockup, that's the best place," he said. "Put a brace of bluejackets outside of the door, and he's not going anywhere. And nobody's getting to him either."
Lys ordered a fire laid on the hearth, refilled the lamps with oil, and had a variety of books brought in. Warm clan-woven blankets were piled on the bed. There was a desk with writing materials, and a small table for private dining. French doors led to a balcony overlooking the sea. "Do you think Madelon's going to be any happier if he's kept in a gilded cage? Would she be content in any Ardenine prison, even if it were plush? Or is this supposed to make you feel less guilty?" When Lys showed Madelon his new quarters, he paused just inside the door and took a good look around. He's doing the same as he did at Queen Court, Lys thought, the same as I would do, surveying the defenses and how to break through them. The Southerner had said little since his escape attempt, but she was under no illusion that he'd given up. He walked farther into the room, setting down his bag with his belongings. He'd been forced to give up his ruined mudback uniform coat after his escape attempt. Rather than put him into Queen's Guard blue or Highlander spattercloth, Lys had found him a warm sheepskin coat and a linen shirt, both clan-made. That would likely set tongues to wagging. She handed him a bundle of clothing. "Since the ones you're wearing seem to fit, I brought you 2 more shirts and a pair of breeches in the same size. I'm thinking you'll want to get into a hot bath before dinner."
"Dinner?"
he said, glancing at the table and chairs. "Dinner's at 7 in the dining hall," she said. "I'll have you escorted down when it's time." At first he looked as if he might refuse, but then he nodded.
"All right,"
he said. "I have some business to attend to now. Is there anything else you need, Captain?" When he looked at her, it was like a sword rammed through her gut.
"No, ma'am."
"When you're ready for your bath, just knock. The guards are right outside." She left him standing alone in the center of the room, the bundle of clothing in his hands, the sound of the crashing waves all around. 35. The Busker. Lys found Sasha in the garrison house, where she was helping the new arrivals settle in. Most of the Highlanders who had been stationed there had been deployed to help with the attack on Delphi. Now Bosley's squadron would stay to reinforce the garrison here. Lys embraced her friend, reassured by the solid feel of her in the quicksand of her life. "What's the news?" she said. "Have you wrung any more information from the Busker?" Sasha shook her head.
If you ask me, it's a waste of time. You're coming all the way out here," she said. "Finn used wizard persuasion to try and get the truth out of him, but it didn't work. Then he set himself on fire, and—"
Finn?
"No, the busker."
What? Liz stared at her. Was he badly hurt?
"It burned his arm pretty bad before we could put it out. It's looking a lot better now."
Was he trying to kill himself? Sasha shook her head.
"I don't know what he was thinking. But we stripped everything out of his room that we thought he could harm himself with, and he hasn't tried it again, so maybe he learned his lesson. He keeps begging for a mouth harp, a drum, a set of pipes, something he can play music with. It's like he's starving for it."
There had been a time when being without music would have broken Liz's spirit, but that was a long time ago. "Or he's playing you," Liz said. "You haven't given him anything, have you? Anything to play, I mean."
Sasha shook her head. "That seemed like a bad idea after what happened in Ragmarket. He fancies himself to be a charmer, but it's all a big show. Now he's pretending to be sick." Sasha snorted in disgust.
Liz squeezed Sasha's shoulder. She knew that much of her anger stemmed from Liz's close call the night of the concert, the fact that Sasha hadn't been able to prevent it, and the fact that nobody had been held accountable for Staunton and Carew. Yet. Still, it almost seemed like Sasha was trying to convince herself. "Have you heard any news from Arden? Any signs that they might come after the busker?"
Sasha hesitated. "All's quiet as far as Arden is concerned, but people in town are on edge. They say they're seeing a lot of strangers on the streets. I'm thinking, it's a port town. What do you expect?"
Liz laughed, but she couldn't help feeling a prickle of unease. Chalk Cliffs didn't see near the shipping traffic that it once did. Why would there be a sudden influx of strangers? The guardhouse wasn't exactly a dungeon by castle standards, but it was relatively secure, being built of stone and lodged within the stone walls of the keep. Maybe we should move the busker into the cliffside tower with Madelon, Liz thought, since that's the most impregnable part of the keep. Most of the cells they passed by were empty, save those occupied by a few local thieves and street fighters. With less commerce, there were fewer sailors getting into the kind of mischief that happens in port. As they neared the end of the hall, Liz could hear a faint sound, like moaning, that grew louder until they stood before a heavy cell door.
"Well, he's still at it,"
Sasha said. Then she banged open the door.
"You there! Wake up! Someone's here to see you."
Liz followed Sasha into the cell and scanned the room. A wash basin on a stand, a chamber pot, a narrow pallet on the floor, piled with blankets, someone huddled underneath. That was it. Sasha marched over to the bed and shook its occupant roughly.
"I said get up." "I'm getting ready to get up," the person muttered. "Just give me a minute. It's just so bloody cold here that it's hard to get out from under the blankets."
The bed's occupant sat up, shivering, shoulders hunched. It was the busker, but he'd changed for the worse since he'd charmed her in the street. His face had gone from finely etched to hollow-cheeked and haggard. Though he'd claimed to be cold, his face was shiny with sweat, and his damp hair was plastered to his forehead. He scratched himself in a rude place.
"What time is it, anyway?" "Time to get up." "Time to take a piss, you mean?"
Walking on his knees to the edge of the pallet, he was fumbling with the buttons on his breeches when he looked up and spotted Liz. Swearing, he dove back under the covers.
"You should have told me somebody was here,"
he said, his voice muffled by blankets.
"Who am I? Nobody."
Sasha shook her head in disgust, giving her an I-told-you-so look.
"Busker," Liz said sharply. "Don't waste any more of our time. Take a piss if you need to, and let's talk."
He sat up again, the blanket draped over his head like a voyageur's cowl, and blinked at her like an owl in daylight.
And then, somehow, he slipped over the edge of the bed and down on one knee on the floor, arms spread gracefully, head bowed, a genuflection worthy of any up-and-comer at court. "Your munificence," he said, "please forgive me.